Sup you sinister folks, welcome to the part 4, of What If Deku's Cursed Blood, Could You Know Reverse Death, Chapter 11 A Sinister Intrusion. It was into a rather plain office that Mitsuki Bakugo and her son Katsuki walked, quite a bit earlier than needed. The two were clad in the best formal clothes they could find in their closets, the mother well aware of the impact presentation might make on the inauspicious day. The rest of their lives could very well be at stake here, and they needed every advantage they could scrounge up if they wanted even a hope of walking free. Too bad only one of the two truly meant their repentance. Mrs. Bakugo, on behalf of UA Academy, allow me to present the demands and conditions for your son to avoid criminal charges, immediately spoke a tall, sharp-featured man with stylish hair as the two entered. Words dropped from his tongue like that of the consummate charmer, his easygoing demeanor disarming. His identification card reads Sakamoto. Mind you, these are only on behalf of the school. Next to the obviously long-retained lawyer, who stood behind the single desk that was present, an imposing woman exuding an air of 1,000 victories stepped forward, taking the man's left side. Her violet locks were crowned in an austere bun except for two bangs that framed her stern face, and the power suit she wore was impeccable. Her identification card reading Kamishiro was clipped to her chest. On behalf of the Asui family, it is my duty and honor to ensure my clients be assured their lives will no longer be placed in jeopardy at the hands of a poorly raised brat with delusions of grandeur, the woman proclaimed, staring dispassionately at the Bakugos. Katsuki shifted where he stood, glaring at the bitch that dared to badmouth him. He wondered why his mother wasn't unleashing her usual temper on these extras already. On the opposite side of Sakamoto stood another woman, this one wearing glasses, a tan blazer with a white skirt, and a clearly angry visage. On behalf of the Ida family, I will guarantee that no evil here goes unpunished, the second woman declared, taking a seat along with the other attorneys. Hange was stamped on her identification card. Mitsuki swallowed hard, already sweating buckets under such blistering glares. Everything from this point on depended on her son sticking to the plan. And whatever mercy could be found at the hands of the intimidating lawyers the Asui and Ida families had delivered them to. The ride to the USJ. The remaining students of Class 1A, plus zombies, were currently bundled on a bus on their way to being tested on the most important role of being a hero, saving lives. Many were excited at such a prospect, others were nervous, others still were distracted. And this is powder for your nose, Momo explained as she pointed to an open compartment in the ridiculously large makeup case sitting next to her. With an angelic laugh, Lily clapped in delight from the mature girl's lap. It's incredible, the little zombie cried, a smile so pure it blinded half the students stretching across her face. It's prettier than the professional sets Lily saw backstage. With the bus designed so that its seats were against the windows, the need to have students cramped into pairs had been eliminated. Momo was thankful as Yuku's observational skills had allowed him to notice this fact before anyone had wasted time choosing partners, though it hadn't stopped Ida from trying. Her being able to more easily spoil Lily was a nice perk too. Man, is it still weird to anyone that we're sharing our education with two zombies now? Kirishima asked. No one in particular. I can't decide if Midraya's more manly for having them around or not. The redhead's words may have seemed questioning, but his ruby eyes were undeniably sad. It was obvious the teen wished they could give the little girl final rest. In his opinion, of the two zombies she unequivocally deserved a proper send-off to the afterlife. It's wrong, Ojiro grumbled, hearing Kirishima's words and deciding to throw in his own 2 yen. The tailed boy's frown spoke of pure animosity and rejection. Perturbed, the spiky redhead leaned away from his classmate. Dude, what's your problem? Kirishima asked. Ojiro merely crossed his arms in judgment. True heroes do their own work, the tailed boy stated, nodding to himself. They don't stoop to using others. Unable to keep himself from eavesdropping, Tokoyami clenched his fist as he reined in his anger. A lecture was the least of what he wanted to give his peer, Ojiro hadn't only just insulted his friend, but he'd also offended the raven-headed boy himself. Dark Shadow, the eldritch entity that lived inside of him thanks to his quirk, was much the same to him as Taya and Lily were to Izuku. He'd long ago come to terms with and befriended the sentient creature in order to become a hero, it standing as his strength, and it was beyond rude for someone to openly denounce that kind of partnership as something foul out of turn. Don't. Izuku's soft warning was accompanied by a warm hand resting on Tokoyami's shoulder. It's not worth it. Turning, the raven-headed teen saw his friend looking back at him with an earnest smile and clear eyes. Beside the green-haired teen, Asui, Tsu, sat nose deep in a notebook that looked exactly like the one in his own hands. Of course, Tokoyami replied just as softly, reopening his notebook. I do indeed possess something much worthier of occupying my time with. Looking down, the raven-haired teen, and even a dark shadow after a minute, once again became absorbed in the pages of his notebook. Curiosity had led him into asking Tsu what had her so engrossed when they'd first set off for the testing site, and surprise had greeted him when he'd been informed it was a quirk analysis authored by their mutual green-haired friend. It had made immediate sense to him that Izuku would pay that kind of attention to his princess. Admitted or not. But then his friend had given him one as well. Opening the innocent-looking book had revealed page after page of incredibly accurate and extensive details about his own quirk. Further examination had shown that there were sections dedicated to everything from gear that could theoretically boost his performance to tactics that would give him an edge in battle. One particular entry postulated the idea of Dark Shadow, forming a sort of armor around his body. That one caught both of their attentions. In the rear of the bus, Mina and Taru sat together, quietly talking amongst themselves. The pink-skinned girl was just shy of fuming. Every time she tried to have a little fun or lighten up the mood a little, something came along and sabotaged her. With her last hope for a proper romance to gossip about failing to bear fruit, for the moment, she felt it was high time she pranked someone. And she knew just the target. Minutes-chan, maybe we should lay low for today, Taru pleaded, dressed in her hero costume like everyone else, that is to say, gloves and a pair of boots. Besides, there's no ammunition to use. They're all clean. The pink-haired girl considered her friend's words, finding her other classmates extremely boring today. Why couldn't everyone act more like Kiri used to, and provide her never-ending entertainment? Yeah. Maybe you're right. Mina conceded, before noticing Taru's words were a little too accurate. They really do look clean. Too clean. Back at the front of the bus, Izuku and Tsu were decked in their repaired suits, which looked better than new. But what had caught the pinkette's attention wasn't the sudden increased quality of her classmates' costumes, or the addition of strange-looking guns on the Verdeinet's person. No, what drew her eye was that Tay and Lily appeared exceptionally hygienic. And seeing undead so spiffed was unnatural. Wasn't it? Mina quietly admitted to herself that perhaps Lily had been allowed to use a shower, but that didn't account for the appearance of the less mentally present Tay now, did it? I can't believe she finished your weapons in only 4 days, Karo, Tsu admitted, expressing her surprise at the artillery before her when she could finally break away from her notebook. Izuku nodded in agreement, pulling out and examining one of his new pieces from its shoulder holster. Hatsune had been able to complete 3 models, ahead of time, a blocky pistol, a sturdy-looking SMG, and a menacing pump-action shotgun. The simplest had been for Izuku, who hadn't wanted to deal with unwieldy weaponry so early in his career. Lily had been given the SMG, her small size perfect for agile movements and rapid-fire attacks. That left Tay with the shotgun, a decision the green-haired teen was still a little unsure of. I'm just as surprised. Izuku agreed, happy to finally see some of his imagined gadgets come to life. These would be the tools that would become fundamental in his future as a pro. They're just prototypes though. I need to do some testing first, hey Midraya. Mina's shout overrode whatever the green-haired teen was going to say. The pinkette's overly giddy expression didn't sit well with the resident Necromancer, or frog girl. In perfect sync, Izuku and Tsuyu turned to look at Mina, earning both an even more pronounced grin. You know, I've been noticing that Tae-chan's always looking clean and healthy. The pinkhead began, attempting to draw her target in. The confused stares from the green duo let her know she'd made an easy catch. Is it difficult for you to wash her during bath time? Izuku sputtered, nearly dropping his new pistol. Holstering the gun, the green-haired boy felt almost every pair of eyes on the bus land on him. Even Tsuyu's. Especially Tsuyu's. I do the best I can, Izuku fumbled, trying to avoid explicit details. My mother helps the most though, to make sure she feels clean. The green-haired teen was sure that most of his classmates didn't buy his hasty explanation, but at the very least it appeared nobody seemed to want to press the issue. So, you've seen her, them, naked. Mineta was that nobody apparently, quickly jumping to the worst conclusions. You've been with both of them. Naked. In the bathroom. At this point, Mina and Taru had accomplished their mission, and were covertly covering their mouths and stomachs in a vain attempt to contain their uncontrollable giggling. Others weren't so delighted, and had turned green at the implications. Oi! Stop that, you perv! Jiro almost shouted. The punk rock girl could admit to herself that she'd been curious about the topic at one point, but digging into it in public was in extremely bad taste. Mineta, unable to contain himself any longer, jumped up onto his seat, still not even standing eye level with the green-haired teen. This is so unfair, Midraya. The pervy midget shouted, flailing his arms for added effect. We can't even land a kiss on a girl, and yet you can just grab these two by the poo. Bang! Quick as lightning, Izuku drew his pistol, took aim, and fired, shooting the midget right in the chin. The piece of tech worked exactly as intended, releasing the realistic sound effect for maximized intimidation factor but including almost no recoil. The bus was deafening in its silence. The members of 1A that had been observing the spectacle were beyond speechless. Their vice president had just shot a classmate. Heroes in training they might have been, but none had any idea of how to react to the situation. On one hand it was a no-brainer that shooting someone probably wasn't the right answer. On the other hand, Mineta. HMMFFF. Mineta had recoiled from the impact of the shot, which had struck with almost the equivalent force of a strong sucker punch, but it was the quickly expanding foam that had caused him to attempt to cry for help. Unfortunately, or fortunately depending on how you felt about the midget, the bubbling concoction quickly covered his mouth before solidifying a moment later. If the diminutive pervert wanted to speak again he'd need outside assistance. Or make peace with ripping off his lips. Gaha. Tae groaned, snapping the busload of students from their shock. You're right, Hatsum really did make them exactly as requested, Izuku replied, clicking the safety switch on his pistol, keen to prevent a misfire of his weapon. In a move that obviously still needed work, the green-haired teen flicked the gun into a spin around his index finger before holstering it. Maybe I should let her make all our gear? It'd be a great partnership. Tsuyu's resultant croaking closely resembled a rebuke, and coupled with her poking of Izuku's cheek in clear disapproval sent many of their classmates into fits of humor. Meanwhile, at the front of the bus, Aizawa chose to ignore the shenanigans of his students for the moment, unable to shake the suspicion that something wasn't right. It doesn't bode well that we still have no idea who did it, Aizawa thought, mulling over the morning's incident once again. Or, more importantly, what purpose it served. Earlier in the day, before he'd even had a chance to roll out of bed, the gruff pro hero had been informed by a call from UA secretaries that the school's perimeter had been breached at some point during the night. The feat itself was less impressive than the fact that the gaping hole left in the defensive wall had been made without any indicative noise. If it hadn't been for the original alarm sounding from the barriers first being initiated, the break-in might never have been discovered until an arriving student had noticed it. As it was, after a hasty search of the grounds and the school from top to bottom, nothing had been turned up. That alone put the entire staff even more on their guard. In more than one hero's opinion, finding no clues at all was more suspicious and worrisome than if they'd uncovered traces of someone. We should have postponed this. Aizawa reflected, I don't like this. Unfortunately, it wasn't like he could turn the bus around now. 10 minutes later, entrance of the USJ. Entering through the reinforced doors of the massive domed facility, Aizawa and his 19 students, plus 2 zombies, were greeted by a truly breathtaking sight. From the massive walkway they stood on that dropped away via stairs, a multitude of catastrophes could be seen. In the distance an artificial lake glistened, a 6-tiered spiral flume releasing water near a small yacht that appeared shipwrecked. Across from the lake rose a miniature mountain range, deep crevices clear to see even from this distance. Next door to the mountains rested a huge, crumbling mound of earth where half-submerged structures bespoke of a devastating landslide. Opposing glass domes, one decorated in flames while the other in storm clouds, squatted to the group's right and next to the lake. Lastly, a small-scale city taken right out of a post-apocalyptic movie stood to their left. Connecting all of these zones was a beautiful plaza with a fountain that was a perfect place to use as a hub and rest area. All told, it was a perfect place for training any quirk imaginable. Everyone, I've been waiting for you, greeted a seemingly living spacesuit. Welcome. Before the students of 1A could think quickly enough to recognize the famous hero, a certain nerd blurted out the knowledge. It's the space hero 13. Izuku gushed, introducing the beloved figure. As a rescue hero, they've saved tons of people from all kinds of disasters. The green-haired teen's sharing of information was well received by both his fellow students and the advising hero, who always appreciated being recognized. Aizawa, standing to the side, glanced around in thought. Something wasn't right. Again. 13, where's All Might? The gruff teacher asked, moving closer to his co-worker. If something had happened, he didn't want to worry his students when finding out. He was supposed to meet us here. To Class 1A, what followed their homeroom teacher's inquiry was a hushed conversation in a secret language spoken alongside a game of charades. 13 mysteriously holding up 3 fingers while whispering. Wondering if he should be worried, the resident Necromancer looked around with a frown. The green-haired teen was unable to discern what the 2 pro-heroes were discussing, but if Aizawa-sensei's body language was anything to go by, then it wouldn't hurt to be on high alert. Beside him, Tay slipped into a tenser stance, not helping Izuku's nerves one bit. Lily, in contrast, merely grabbed onto his pants leg nervously. I see. He was just delayed. Aizawa's grousing suddenly garnered the attention of his students. Well, it can't be helped. Let's get started. A quick bow from the space-themed hero and Class 1A was handed over to their rescue instructor. Now then, 13 began, who can tell me the best way to tell a combat quirk from a support quirk? After tricking the class with that opening question, since they revealed it was how a quirk was used that decided its classification from a professional heroing standpoint, the rescue hero launched into their speech. Attentive so as to not be thrown off again, the students ended up being exceedingly receptive to the lecture. They'll earned, if they hadn't already considered the fact, that quirks could be either tremendously beneficial or extremely detrimental to society, based on users' concern for the safety of those around them. Izuku personally loved the part where 13 reiterated that quirks that were considered dangerous or dark shouldn't be judged villainous out of turn unless they were used with the intention to kill. With a flourish, the rescue hero ended their discourse and bowed, earning cheers from 1A. As a whole, the group felt further energized to learn rescue procedures. And then the electricity flickered and died. Aizawa was the first to feel it, an overwhelming presence oozing malice, coming from the center of the plaza down below. He was too slow to stop Izuku, however, who walked over to the stairs to look out toward the fountain. The pro-hero had no way of knowing his problem child had his own sensitivity to such anomaly. Unaware of his teacher's alarm, the green-haired teen's blood was making his veins tingle all over, and not in a good way. Tei's low growl and Lily's soft whimpers only amplified his growing fears. "Sensei. Tell me this is a drill," Izuku whispered, pinched voice denoting the anxiety he was feeling at the moment. Now standing beside him, Aizawa shook his head. "I can't," the gruff teacher denied. The man's mind raced faster and faster, vainly attempting to conceive of the best way to keep his students safe from a threat he couldn't even see yet. "Everyone, gather together and don't move." As Aizawa bellowed his orders, a massive hole in reality twisted into existence down in the plaza. In a split second, the shadowy tier ripped open, exploding outward to cover the entire fountain area in a massive, dark cloud of mist. From the writhing darkness, figures began to emerge, too many to count. From their distance facial expressions were hard to denote, but the common demeanor they carried made it clear they weren't friendly at all. Izuku, analytical mind whirring into gear, noticed immediately that a large portion of the mist-walking invaders were mutants, or at least held dominant mutant genes that colored their physical traits. Even with such little information to go on, the green-haired teen felt his stomach drop at the sight. It was a sad reality, but the quirk hierarchy the world lived by didn't take kindly to those who appeared less than human, growing more discriminatory the more bizarre the appearance. He might have sounded like a hypocrite, but in that moment, Izuku knew beyond a doubt these were villains. "Whoa, this is just like the entrance exam," Kirishima exclaimed, stepping closer to the edge of the stairway. "Did our scenarios begin already?" "Stay back," Izuku barked, throwing an arm out to block the crimson-haired teen. "We need to obey Aizawa-sensei." Below the two pro-heroes and heroes in training, the expanding dark mist paused before receding into a humanoid shape. If humans had black fire with yellow eyes for heads. The mist man looked up, gazing intently at the observers above. Unsure if it would work, Izuku put his entire focus into his hearing. "Teen and Eraserhead." The green-haired teen managed to hear, Schedule said. "Might would. Today." The words were disconcerting, but Aizawa's response was even worse. "Damn, so these are the bastards behind the infiltration." "Infiltration? Where?" Izuku's mind shuddered to think what they were going to do if these were villains powerful enough to break into one of Japan's premier hero academies and get away with it. Aizawa clenched his fists and grit his teeth in frustration. This was a disaster. There were enough scumbags down there to give him problems even if he had 13's help, and as it was he couldn't allow the rescue hero to leave his students unattended. That meant he'd be doing this solo. Instantly accepting the reality of the situation, the normally gruff pro-hero pulled up his goggles, covering his eyes completely. So be it. Izuku didn't know what to do, but he knew there was no way he or his classmates were ready for this. A life-and-death situation was so far above a combat drill it wasn't funny. And, even from this distance the green-haired teen could feel the bloodlust rolling off so many of the villains. Some signal, unseen and unheard, must have sounded because as the mob of invaders advanced, Izuku seeing only three hold back by the fountain. Of the three, even with the dark mist man present, it was a lanky man with silver hair that projected the most maleficence, even more so than the massive man-beast with its brain exposed. This probably had to do with the fact that the silver-haired man was covered head to toe in dismembered hands. Izuku hoped those were just props to intimidate them. Because it was working. "Sensei, those three in the back are probably the leaders," the green-haired teen informed, unable to leave such information to chance even though a pro-hero such as Eraserhead no doubt already noticed such a thing. "I know," Aizawa said curtly, bending his knee slightly in preparation of launching himself forward. Izuku, seeing his teacher preparing to preemptively strike their enemies, couldn't hold back what was haunting his thoughts. "Sensei. They're organized," the green-haired teen whispered, pressing through his bone-shaking terror. "That means they probably have a plan." Of course the villains had a plan. Going so far as to infiltrate such a prestigious school as UA and then to dare attack students on top of that? Normal villains wouldn't be brave enough to even consider such a thing unless there was a solid strategy planned. I know, Aizawa repeated, this time turning halfway to consider his problem child. Stay with your classmates, keep them together. Without giving any further orders, Aizawa hurled himself forward, bounding down the stairs in an effort to prevent the mob of villains from getting any closer to his students. Without waiting for any further orders, Izuku headed back to his classmates, walking into a group of students who were beginning to panic as the weight of their current crisis settled on their shoulders. Sensei, shouldn't the facility's alarms be sounding? Momo asked 13 as Izuku melded into the ranks of 1A. What's happened to the sensors? The space-themed hero was concentrating on a device on their wrist, pressing buttons over and over again with no response. They should be responding, 13 said, seemingly confused as to why their tech wasn't working properly. Todoroki stepped forward, face as emotionless as it had ever been. The dual-haired teen was by this time recognized by many in 1A as their strongest member. Those same students felt the heterochromatic quirk was a nice reassurance to have around. The more important question. Todoroki paused, making sure everyone was paying attention, is did they only appear here? Or all around campus? The idea that this was a widespread incursion boggled the minds of many. No one had been gutsy enough to launch a full-scale war against UA since the early days of the hero profession, when the academy had first been established. Unfortunately, all we know right now is that they've attacked here, a place isolated from the main campus, Todoroki continued, glaring disdainfully at the mob of villains. And what's worse, they chose a time when a class was meant to be present. This was planned, it must be. Izuku, seeing the hush that followed the grimace Hirshin as his only window to speak, stepped up next to the heterochromatic. We need to evacuate. Now, the green-haired teen declared. With 13 in the lead, we should be able to make it. If he'd had the time, Izuku would have appreciated the expressions many of his classmates were giving him. In these moments of stress and danger, almost all eyes looked to him with hints of the faith that comes from understanding someone stepped up to take charge, someone's working to get through the adversity. But he didn't have the time, because he'd stepped up, and was working. If the villains are inhibiting the sensors, communications might be jammed as well, Izuku continued, turning to the classmate who could check this for him. Kaminari, see if your headset can reach outside. If it can, call for help. Utterly flabbergasted, the electric blonde stared at the green-haired teen even as he raised a hand to the device on his ear. How did you? Kaminari stopped himself, recognizing they were all in too dear a situation to waste time asking questions, right now. In seconds, the teen had checked every channel his gadget could scan. He shook his head in disbelief. It's all jammed. But Aizawa-sensei. Momo trailed off, quick to begin worrying about their homeroom teacher. As if calling his name was a magnet, 1A turned as a whole to watch the combat that had just started down below. Breaking from their pack, 3 villains had rushed forward, to form an interception against the gruff teacher. Each of the thugs were mutated in some way that allowed different body parts to act as long-distance weapons, most likely why they'd gone ahead. The trio took aim. Then looked at each other confused as their quirks failed them and nothing happened. In the blink of an eye, Aizawa was on them, immediately wrapping the largest one with his special scarf. Twisting, the pro-hero swung his captive into his compatriots, knocking all 3 of their head together and rendering them unconscious. Witnessing their homeroom teacher able to hold his own, the students of 1A felt less opposed toward the idea of evacuating. Making the most of the time they had, the teens turned and made their way toward the entrance of the massive facility. With each step, Izuku grew more despondent. The hero nerd in him knew that for all his strengths, Eraserhead was not a hero meant to combat villains en masse for long. 7 minutes to reach the bus, 3 to get it moving, say 5 to clear the premises. Izuku's mind continued to work in overdrive even as he and his class escaped. And that's assuming whatever's jamming us can't reach farther than the USJ. The green-haired teen quickly came to the conclusion that no matter what they did, Aizawa wouldn't have enough time. Even in a best-case scenario, The pro hero would be overcome by sheer numbers before help could arrive. Meaning that for him to survive, the gruff teacher needed assistance now. Putting all of his brain power into formulating a plan that allowed for entirely green students to actually help a pro, Izuku was unprepared when their situation went from bad to worse. "I'm afraid I can't allow you all to just leave," came a voice that Izuku recognized as the Mist Man's from down by the fountain. Reality warped once more, and where before there'd been a clear path to the exit now writhed a dark violet portal of fog. The green-haired teen watched as the Mist Man stepped from the blackness he created, his mind instantly cataloging the villain's quirk as a teleportation type. That explained how the invaders had gotten inside the USJ so easily. "A pleasure to meet all of you," the Mist Man said, grandly bowing to the group. "May we introduce ourselves? You see, we are known as the League of Villains." The villain's smugness bled through any faux gentlemanliness he'd been attempting to convey. The space hero and the students were trapped, with the mob behind them and a warp user in front. They'd been left without any options for an escape route. "I know it may seem a bit presumptuous of us, but we've invited ourselves here, to this place, this garden of heroes, this renowned academy known as A for one purpose." The Mist Man continued, acting as if he were a ringleader presenting a stage show with how he waved his arms about. Izuku took notice of two things as the villain spoke. The first was that he loved to monologue and was something of a showboat. The second and more important detail was that for barely a second he thought he'd seen some sort of neck brace hidden in the shadowy mist. Almost like some sort of heavy-duty respirator. "We've come to find the number one hero," the Mist Man revealed. "We've come to ensure All Might takes his last breath this day." Not a single student was able to withhold a gasp at that declaration. Izuku knew such a plan was normally ludicrous to even consider. All Might never lost, but just the same he knew that this only put him and his classmates in even greater danger. Villains, especially organized groups like this one, never played fair, and the green-haired teen could already imagine dozens of scenarios that might have a feasible chance at success against the symbol of peace. These nightmares included the villains recruiting someone with a hypersensitive quirk capable of countering the number one hero's indomitable strength to the students being held hostage, in order to force All Might into a protracted fight surrounded by lethally toxic fumes. Now, I believe All Might was to be present for these exercises. The villain's tone was thick with the conceit of a victorious foe. Was there perhaps a change in the day's schedule? The Mist Man began to expand before any answer could be given, losing his humanoid shape to become a malevolent wall of darkness. Then, the wall began to move toward them. "It honestly doesn't matter, I suppose," the villain added, not noticing 13 slowly repositioning themselves. "My job here is the same. Nothing's changed." Izuku knew he needed to help. Leaving things to chance was the worst option. Calmly, the green-haired teen moved Lily behind him while discreetly signaling Tay to inch sideways so she'd be able to react better. The plan would be haphazard, but simple. If things went as he theorized, 13 was about to attempt to use his quirk, Black Hole, on the villain. The villain would of course try to evade, but if he could get himself in just the right placement, he'd be able to use his new pistol to aim for that single piece of gear he'd seen in the mist. Izuku had no guarantee of his expanding foam bullets would work on someone whose natural state of being was so ethereal, but the flash and bang of his attack might distract the villain long enough for 13 to finish the job. If that failed, however, Tay would still be able to take a pot shot with her shotgun, the force of the firearm alone likely to ensure the success of the maneuver. The green-haired teen palmed his weapon, slowly popping off the small leather strap that kept it from falling out by accident, just as the space-themed hero pointed their index finger at the villain. Izuku calmed his heart as much as he could. He needed to boost his meager ability as much as possible. There it was. 13 stepped forward, popping open a finger valve on their glove. Izuku inched sideways, slowly drawing his pistol. He took aim. "Don't underestimate us, you scum. Like hell we're going to just stand here. We're heroes too." And his plan went to shit as Ojiro. closely followed by Kirishima, leapt into the air toward the villain. The two shouted war cries as they engaged the Mist Man and CQC. Or tried to anyway. Both teens passed through the villain without so much as tickling him, only succeeding in getting in the way of the pro hero trying to save their lives. Izuku cursed. The villain was going to be more prepared for any attacks now. The fight had just become even more difficult. Tei's low groan and dark glare directed at the tailed martial artist mirrored the roiling emotions running through the green-haired teen. Of course. The Mist Man said with disdain, even as only students. You're all still fine golden eggs. The villain's acidic yellow eyes moved through the black mist until they could glare at the two interloping students. Ojiro and Kirishima froze, the bloodlust directed at them too much to handle as inexperienced as they were. You two. Get out of the way. 13 screamed, their voice modulators training due to the pro hero's distress. It was too little, too late. Disperse and despair. The villain commanded, his dark mist appearing to draw inward. While you suffer a most torturous death. The Mist Man exploded. It was akin to a pressure valve bursting really. Rolling waves of darkness enveloped the entire class in a rushing wave, blinding them all for a few precious moments. Izuku could still hear though, he heard Tsu's croak of fear so clearly it hurt. Instinctively he reached for her, only to be tackled to the side. Shaking a near concussion from his head, the green-haired teen opened his eyes, realizing it was Ida who had pulled him, and Uraraka had appeared, out of the villain's range. Frantically looking back, Izuku felt his heart stop. His most important people were still inside a now swirling dome of impenetrable shadowy mist. Tsu-chan. Lily-chan. Tei-chan. Izuku screamed in horror, scrambling to reach the dome. He had to save them. He couldn't let them die. A strong hand snatched one of the green-haired teen's flailing arms out of the air, reeling him back with a sharp jerk. Madrya. Calm down. It was Ida, again. The bespectacled teen shook Izuku, trying to reach the vice president through his anguish. Now's not the time to lose focus over your zombies. Before Ida could suggest the thrashing green-haired teen use his control over the zombie girls to keep their classmates safe within the dark prison that held them, which may or may not have worked given the circumstances, the dome dispersed. All that was left was 13 and a near-feral Tei, growling. GGRRRRR. The zombie snarled in the direction of the villain, who was slowly reforming. For one who never spoke, it was clear to see the attempt at separating her from Izuku had upset the undead girl. 13 hesitantly patted themselves down, checking to see if everything was still attached. They'd only managed to evade the mass warping thanks to the zombie's quick action. As the wave of dark mist had approached, she'd grabbed their arm then, used her free hand as an anchor. By punching through the ground, the pro hero made a mental note to demand additional safeguards regarding the undead Madrya used, based on the strength he'd just seen, thereby it would be more than deadly. Tsu-chan. Izuku whispered in a broken voice. His 1,000-yard stare locked on the space the frog girl had occupied not a second ago. Lily-chan. The green-haired teen was drowning in guilt and self-hatred. He'd failed. Again. He'd failed to uphold his promise to the cute little girl who'd suffered so much. He'd failed to protect the girl that had been meaning more and more to him every day. His mind was overclocking, twisting the fate of the two girls into mental horrors of unknown battlefields. Or just straight-up death. The villain's quirk was largely unknown. Its capabilities could have been endless for all he knew. Madrya. Ida called again, anxiously looking from his vice president to the zombie he controlled. Each passing second the undead girl appeared to be slipping into a more berserker-like state. Please, get a hold of yourself. Izuku-kun. Okako cried, trying and failing to break the teen from his trance. Tei was now hunched over, fists clenching and unclenching. Ida and Okako weren't sure which to be more wary of at that moment, the zombie or the villain. GHA. Izuku's head snapped up so hard at the ferocious grunt from the undead girl his blood was forced to heal minute hairline fractures along his atlanto-axis joint. Still alive. The words, he didn't know how he knew, but the green-haired teen's gut, saying that they were true. There was hope. Izuku needed a plan. He needed to act. Lily and Tsu might have still been living now, but there was no way to tell for how long that would hold true. There was just one major problem. His body wouldn't move. Fear and hopelessness had left him paralyzed. I'm powerless by myself, what can I do? Izuku thought, watching wide-eyed as the villain finished, reforming. He'd been right, it turned out. The Mist Man was wearing an apparatus around his neck. It was literally the only piece of him that was solid. Neurons fired, thoughts raced even faster, and Izuku felt, deep inside of himself, something shift. He wants to kill them, my dear ones. His fear caught fire and burned to ash, and in its place rose an insatiable anger. Hate. He needs to be neutralized. Izuku could feel his thoughts being molded by this newborn wrath. Kill. My body needs to move. Izuku's will drank from the fount of his rage, beginning to subconsciously tap into his blood. It felt as if it was boiling. Obey, and then he could stand. Outwardly, the green-haired teen appeared calm and collected, which slightly eased the worry his two classmates had been feeling. But they were behind him. For 13 and the villain, who were positioned to see his front, they saw a silhouetted form, the lenses of a pair of sunglasses giving the figure two round, glowing red eyes. Both adults assumed that it was a trick of the lighting, affected by the power outage caused by the invaders. They were wrong. Behind his sunglasses, Izuku's eyes burned red. Ida, you're the fastest. The green-haired teen's words, while true, felt wrong. I need you to get out, get to campus, and get help. Ida blinked, unprepared for such a cowardly plan, or for him to be the one to have to carry it out. Midoriya, the bespectacled teen protested, even if I wanted to, we're going to give you an opening. Izuku cut him off, and you're going to get out, get to campus, and get help. It wasn't conversation. It wasn't a request. It was an order. And it would be followed. Listen to your vice president. 13 weighed in, agreeing with the plan. He knows your quirk is the only hope to save your classmates. Actually, Izuku just wanted to be rid of the one who would, and already had physically stopped him already. He was going to neutralize the villain, and nobody was getting in his way. But he wasn't going to voice that, of course. Izuku didn't bother lowering his voice. The Mist Man had already been observing him. The zombie girl tensed, completely prepared for any order. Run to the gate and open it for Ida. There was no hesitation or delay in carrying out the command. Much to the surprise of the villain, the girl darted toward the entrance immediately, no sign of concern toward facing his quirk or for her own safety. I won't let you. The Mist Man shouted while throwing his arms out, the limbs extending into shadowy claws. Only to feel a sudden, undeniable pull ripping him away. You have no choice. 13 yelled as they used a black hole to absorb the villain's mist and pull him away. Seeing his chance, Ida shot off after the zombie. Tay reached the gates mere seconds later, Ida catching up to her just as she plunged her crowbar between the metal barriers. In a short amount of time that would have otherwise been concerning, the undead girl had pried the two halves of the gate open, her strength more than a match for the hydraulic system. Holding the metal slabs apart, the tall boy dashed through. Her task complete, Tay pulled her crowbar back, allowing the gate to slam shut. No villains could be allowed an opportunity to chase Ida down. No. The Mist Man howled in obvious distress as he watched the tall boy escape. Damn you. The villain turned to glare at the pro-hero, his acidic eyes now truly cold. So you believe your powerful quirk can save you, do you? Well, distracting 13 with his words, the Mist Man subtly opened a portal behind the pro-hero. Which was exactly what Izuku had been waiting for. His analytical mind had run this exact scenario earlier, which was why he'd already been in motion heading toward 13 the moment Ida took off running. Launching himself airborne, the green-haired teen drop-kicked the space-themed hero out of the way, the instant before the ambush portal could finish turning them into a victim of their own quirk. 13's HUD flashed and blinked in alarm, their suit's sensors disintegrated. A sharp pain shot along their back before a much more blunt form of aggression threw them out of the way. Straining against throbbing aches and shooting agony, the pro-hero managed to shift enough after crashing to the ground to see it had been their green-haired student who's assaulted them. Then they noticed the portal that had formed behind where they'd been standing, and realization sparked that they'd just been saved from causing their own demise. How shameful. Izuku couldn't complete his risky maneuver without a price however. Black Hole's gravitational pull, directed through the portal, caught his right foot halfway through his follow-through. Before either quirk was disengaged, the force of nature devoured his shoe. And then his whole foot. Still in motion, and doing his best to ignore the mind-numbing pain, the green-haired teen willed with all his might for his body to take aim and fire at the villain's neck brace. Thankfully, his body obeyed. 2 consecutive shots rang out, successfully, slamming into the respirator. Bang! Bang! The mist man yelped, rearing back as the unexpected feel of actual pain caused him to flinch. Izuku slammed to the ground hard, back first. Pushing the agony of his injuries aside one more time, he took a few precious seconds to re-aim before firing twice more. Bang! Bang! In a move more instinctual than skill, the villain used his mist to warp the bullets away before contact. But it was already too late. What in the hell is this? The once suave voice rose as alarm turned to horror, the 2 landed shots beginning to work their magic. The bullets expanded, their foam swallowing more and more of the respirator. Terrified, the mist man moved to portal away. When Tay came crashing into him with her crowbar, swinging at the neck brace like she was trying out for the major leagues. The bar of wrought metal smashed into the device with all the power undead muscles could muster, nearly shattering the apparatus. Collapsing to the ground, the mist man choked on cries of pain and panic. Victory won. Izuku forced himself upright, hobbling to stand over his fallen foe. But he didn't think to celebrate. This was far from over. He still had to find his dear friends and make sure they got out of this alive. Then, he was going to put an end to these villains. Oh no. This was just the beginning. Chapter 12 A Sinister Battlefield. Inside the principal's office, located in the depths of UA, Toshinori Yagi sat on one of the 2 couches present while staring into a cup of tea. The pro-hero felt like a child again, being reprimanded for doing something foolish. All the same, he did feel guilty after considering the stupidity of his actions. I'm not saying you should give up your hero work, Nezu reaffirmed, taking a sip of his own tea, but if you're really serious about teaching here, I need you to have a different set of priorities now. Time and place come to mind. When Toshinori had entered the room, already forced back into his emaciated form, the quirked animal had just shaken his head. He hadn't even needed to use high-spec to know what had probably caused the number 1 hero to still be at UA instead of the USJ as scheduled. Seeing as the 2 then had the time, Nezu had decided to give his rookie instructor a rather detailed lecture on responsibility and foresight. I know. Toshinori said, voice petering out, when he realized he didn't quite know how to word his justification. I just can't ignore crimes though. The pro-hero's rather weak explanation earned only a heavy sigh from the quirked animal. Sometimes the principal wished the symbol of peace would use his brain a little more. But you have no issue with ignoring the fact that there are other heroes around? Nezu's questioning rebuttal caught Toshinori off guard. Most of the crimes you prevented today were petty little things better left to other heroes, sidekicks, or in some cases, even the police. The quirked animal caught the skeletal man's hesitant look and locked gazes with him, almost daring another excuse. Well, Toshinori hedged, hindsight rendering him unable to find a good way to refute the principal's words. It was always hard to do so when the quirked animal was right. What about the car accident? Nezu sat back, nodding slowly. The emaciated man relaxed slightly, a flicker of hope coming to life in his non-existent stomach. Ah, yes, the car accident. The principal's adorable tone of voice made Toshinori smile. That smile disappeared when the quirked animal flatly continued with, "It looked to me like the local rescue squad had everything under control before you arrived." It was no use, Toshinori decided. He wasn't going to get out of this well-deserved dressing down anytime soon. The pro-hero supposed the principal was right though. He really should allow the next generation the chance to take over his job while he trained his successor. He just hadn't understood how difficult it would be to just step aside. Meanwhile, at the USJ, in the air above the artificial lake of the flood zone, a swirling portal of darkness tore through reality, spitting out two individuals. These reluctant travelers immediately dropped to the depths below, and unprepared for their repositions as they were, sent up geysers as they struck the water's surface at odd angles. When she was able to right herself, Tsuyu looked around through the clear marine environment in the hopes of spotting either Izuku or one of the zombie girls. Instead, the only recognizable body was the disoriented and currently drowning figure of a blonde wearing a rocker jacket. Denki Kaminari would admit he'd screamed in horror when he felt the darkness wash over him, sucking him away. He'd also admit he hadn't stopped screaming, until the point his back had slammed into water, and that was only because he'd have drowned faster if he hadn't. The third thing the blonde would admit, was that he really wished the day wouldn't get any worse. Oh shit. Oh shit. Where the hell am I? Kaminari's distressed thoughts screamed in his head. He couldn't even tell up from down, he'd gotten so turned around while sinking. Trying, and failing, to stay calm, he opened his eyes to look around and see if another of his classmates had been thrown in with him. He instantly regretted doing so. Oh fuck. 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 Swimming toward the blonde like a missile was an ugly villain that looked like a cross between a shark and a scuba diver. Even from their current distance, Kaminari could tell the criminal's bite would be a horrible way to go. The electrical student redoubled his efforts to swim anywhere, but gained no noticeable results. It was obvious he wasn't going to escape in time. Not like this. Not like this. Kaminari mentally shrieked, losing hope at the sight of the villain opening his super-wide jaws to bite his head off. I don't want to die a virgin. At the last possible second, a green blur collided with the criminal, stunning both him and the blonde. Taking a second to shake the hysteria from his mind, Kaminari realized the blur was actually his froggy classmate. In one fluid motion, Tsuyu used her powerful legs to double-kick the villain deep into the lake while propelling herself towards the struggling blonde. Wrapping her tongue around the electric hero wannabe, the frog girl quickly brought the two to the surface. Are you alright, Kaminari-san? Karo, Tsuyu asked as soon as their heads were above water. Said blonde was too busy coughing and hacking water out of his mouth and lungs to respond right away, the experience leaving him shaken. Realizing they were alive and breathing air, the electrical student turned to his classmate in adoration. Thank you. Thank you. Kaminari shouted, trying to hug the frog girl. His attempts were instantly met with being tongue-tossed into the air and onto the yacht behind them before he could make contact. Gah! Ow! Climbing onto the ship, Tsuyu began to consider all the information available, her mind going into overdrive. She desperately wanted to know what was happening everywhere else, and where her cinnamon roll had ended up. Being under Izuku's control had given her access to certain knowledge about the green-haired teen she'd never be willing to share with others, specifically sensitive information about the side effects of his quirk. For example, she knew the zombie girls were, even now, able to find their master. It didn't matter how far the distance or number of barriers between them, he was like a beacon. It was a skill she wished she still had within her. Ah. Thanks for saving me. Kaminari said with some shyness when he noticed his froggy classmate nearing him at the yacht's railing. He was thankful for the few seconds to breathe and calm down she'd given him. And sorry about the outburst. I didn't mean anything by it. I'm not Mineta. Tsuyu turned her expressionless gaze to her classmate, scrutinizing the blonde the same way she'd seen her mother do to a rival attorney once. The frog girl knew very well that Kaminari was nowhere near a pervert like their midget of a classmate, but at the same time he was even farther away from being a saint like Izuku. There had been multiple occasions where she and the other girls had seen the blonde position his hands in almost hopeful preparation for Momo to collide with him whenever the mature girl walked or worked around him. And his hands hadn't been aiming for PG areas. It was more like they'd been positioned toward places their class president would be able to use her quirk the easiest. Izuku had never, and would never, do something like that. In fact, the cinnamon roll went out of his way to keep his hands from even accidentally touching somewhere he shouldn't. Even though he was free to hug and touch her whenever he wanted, the green-haired teen always made sure to never disrespect her body. The electric hero wannabe, meanwhile, shifted uncomfortably under the unblinking examination. Was it something he said? "It's okay, I understand," Tsuyu said in her usual monotone after letting the moment drag on for an instant more, "but we're not out of danger yet. Karo." The blonde immediately whipped his head around at the announcement, eyes darting across the water frantically. "What do you mean?" Kaminari asked. Just as a large number of villainous faces broke to the surface. They were surrounded. Oh no. There must be a dozen of them. The hero wannabe's scream of panic led Tsuyu to make an even less flattering comparison. She was sure that Izuku would have already had a firm grasp of the situation by now, and probably 5 plans to overcome their adversity besides. As it stood now, it seemed like it was up to her to take the reins and think up a plan. It was times like this that made the frog girl grateful she'd been blessed with intelligence instead of conventional beauty. "Calm down," Tsuyu said, trying to project calmness and determination. She didn't need the electric blonde to fall apart and leave her with dead weight. "We need to brainstorm on how to overcome this. The best way to do that is to pool our strengths and weaknesses." The blank look her classmate was sending her way did not encourage the frog girl in the slightest. "Okay." Kaminari trailed off, obviously unsure where or how he was supposed to begin. The amphibian teen held back a sigh. She knew it wasn't the blonde's fault battle planning wasn't his forte, but she missed Izuku even more now. "My quirk allows me to do pretty much everything a frog can do," Tsuyu started, attempting to show her classmate what she wanted him to do as quickly as possible. There was no telling if the villains would attempt to board the yacht or not. "My tongue can extend up to 20 meters when last I checked, I can leap really high, my hands and feet can stick to most surfaces, and I can spit the toxins in my stomach pretty far. Although, they're not strong enough to cause more than a light rash right now." According to the later updates in Izuku's analyses of her quirk, the toxins in her stomach probably functioned much like those of real frogs, and depended on her diet for their strength. That meant if she wanted to try and weaponize her spit, she'd have to ingest certain natural toxins and see if they amplified her own toxicity. It was too bad she hadn't had time for experimentation yet. "Oh, well, I discharge electricity." Kaminari started, unsure how to word his skill set without making himself sound like a worthless idiot. Then a massive clawed hand of water sliced the yacht in two, causing their only means of staying away from the villains to begin sinking. "I can discharge up to 10,000 volts. But afterwards I won't be able to think for a while. And I can't direct the discharge. And... Watching the electric blonde begin to panic, Tsuyu felt her eye twitch. The frog girl had to wonder how an idiot like this managed to pass the written test if he couldn't even see the glaringly obvious solution to their predicament. "And what do we do now?" Kaminari asked, finally succumbing to the need to breath over panicking. The hero wannabe looked one moment shy of attempting to hug his classmate again, seeking one last comfort before facing death. Natsu's only response came in the form of a nun-2, gentle kick to the blonde's rear, sending the teen head first towards the water, and villains, below. For the next 10 seconds, lightning danced across the lake in beautifully arcing bolts. The accompanying screams of pain of over a dozen villains only added to the performance put on by the super move. Same time, conflagration zone. Surrounded by hell on earth as he was, a casual observer of Shito, Todoroki in this moment would have never been able to tell, but the heterochromatic teen was pissed. Some hopped-up villains had invaded his school's rescue training grounds, split their class up, and, judging by the disturbed looks he was getting from the criminals in front of him, planned to maim if not kill them. It was almost enough for him to consider using his quirk's full potential. Almost, Todoroki-san? Called a nervous voice. The teen in question didn't answer verbally, but he did cock his head to the side ever so slightly. We're kinda surrounded. What are we gonna do? There was a muffled sound behind Shito, like a pocket or pouch had been dug into, before a second voice chimed in. Don't sweat it, Sero. We're going to do what 1A does best. The doughy voice of Rikito Sato, loudly proclaimed. The dual-colored teen could almost see it as his giant classmate slammed his fists together with a grin on his sizable lips. We're going to kick their asses. The declaration was followed by the sound of a face being stuffed with some sort of food, though knowing Sato's quirk, Shito wagered it was a confection of some sort. Do not be overconfident, came the calm voice of Mezzo, Shoji. Arrogance is as much an enemy on the battlefield as any opposition. The tentacle teen stepped forward until he was next to his dual-haired classmate. The two quietest members of Class 1A, bar perhaps Koji Koda, gave each other a nod, acknowledging the situation. The two teens behind Shito and Mezzo nodded to each other, walking up and falling into battle stances as the heterochromatic of the group stared flatly at the villains arrayed against them. This is not an efficient use of our time, the dual-colored teen thought to himself. Deciding to take matters into his own hands, he raised his right foot. Simultaneously, in the ruined zone, trapped in the dilapidated remnants of what looked to be a simulated penthouse suite, Ijiro Kirishima had only once before hated himself more than he did at that very moment. He'd foolishly charged in after Ojiro to take on the mist villain, and in doing so had only succeeded in getting the two of them transported to some random location that, oh yeah, was teeming with villains. The criminals were literally coming out of the walls, what walls the penthouse still had standing, that is. The crumbling framework of the structure. The two teens found themselves and offered little resistance in the face of the quirk-powered attacks. The heroes in training had to constantly shift their attention around to ensure no sneak attacks succeeded. Man. This is so unmanly. Kirishima shouted as he clotheslined a villain that had tried to rush him. At his back, he heard the martial artist of the class land two substantial-sounding punches to his own opponent. How you holding up, Ojiro? The tailed teen was cursing his foolishness with every counter he employed against an attacker. He was ashamed that his selfish desire to show his classmates how a true hero did things had landed him and his red-headed comrade in jeopardy. I'm fine, Kirishima, Ojiro assured, muscular tail tripping, and then swatting away, a hapless woman with tiger paws for arms. Please forgive my foolishness. I fear my impetuousness might have endangered us all more than we already were. Confused at his classmate's remark, Kirishima thoughtlessly brained an extremely short villain that thought his height offered him some advantage. He should have relied more on the buzzsaws in his forearms instead. What do you mean? The redhead shouted over the war cries of a trio of villains that charged through a hole in the wall next to him. Hardening himself, the teen laid out all three assailants with a punch each. Wait. You don't think? Ojiro nodded, grateful for an apparent lull in combat as no new villains appeared. I don't think we were the only ones dispersed, the tailed teen affirmed, thinking back to the mist villain's words. The rolling bank of black fog hadn't stopped when it had hit him and Kirishima, he was sure of it. I think the rest of our class was separated too. Kirishima grit his teeth, sudden worry threatening to overtake his usual battle confidence. If Ojiro was right, then everyone else was probably facing off against a horde of villains too. And that meant there was no rescue party for them. Everyone needed rescuing. With no warning, the only hitherto untouched wall to the suite exploded. Scrambling back, the two teens stared in bewilderment as a giant of a man with an elephant's head and physique stomped into the room. Trumpeting, the villain stampeded toward the heroes in training. Unsure if their collective might would be enough to stop such an assault, Kirishima grabbed Ojiro by the shoulder and moved to dodge when a familiar-smelling liquid dripped onto his cheek. Reacting quickly, the redhead wiped the fluid away before throwing himself and his tailed classmate to the side right as the ceiling collapsed. Yahoo! Came the exuberant cry of a voice Kirishima would know anywhere. Coming through. As the dust settled, the two embattled teens were greeted with a sight for sore eyes. Standing on top of the now debris-covered and unconscious elephant villain with her hands on her hips was Mina Ashido, grinning widely. The pink-skinned girl gestured to a pair of floating gloves next to her. "Sitaru," the acidic teen said, waving her hand about the room, "I told you the stairs would take too long." "Mina!" Kirishima shouted, charging up to the young heroine in training. "That was so manly, I can't even believe it," said trainee turned at the sound of her name being called, smile growing even wider when she saw the culprit. The pinkette launched herself off of the downed villain and soared right into the waiting arms of her red-headed friend. "Kiri!" Mina shouted back, allowing herself to be spun once before tapping a shoulder to be set down. The acid user noticed her tailed classmate, still on guard. "So you guys got sent here too?" Kirishima and Ojiro both cursed. Their previous hypothesis had just been proven correct. The entirety of Class 1A had most likely been scattered across the USJ. "Guys?" called out Taru, whose gloves were now floating by the hole made by the elephant villain. "I think we have a more immediate problem." Clambering over to their classmate, the other three heroes in training collectively gasped. The hole opened up to the outside, a world of broken buildings and shattered city streets. And everywhere the students looked, there were villains. Instead of cowering, the four members of Class 1A steeled themselves. They weren't going down without a fight. Elsewhere, same time. Izuku stood, or rather, balanced his weight on his remaining foot as he looked down at the villain on the ground. The mist man was frantically clawing at the foam covering his neck brace, desperately sucking in as much air as possible. It was a pitiful visage for a powerless fool, one at his complete mercy. Mercy he wasn't inclined to grant at the moment. With no sign of remorse or hesitation, the green-haired teen raised his pistol and took aim at the last visibly functional piece of the respirator. "Izuku-kun." "No." Okako's scream of anguish pierced the air as the girl tackled her class's vice president, finding it surprisingly easy to take down the green-haired teen. "Heroes don't kill people." The villain, grateful for a moment of respite, rasped in as deep a breath as he could and focused on creating a small portal to flee. As reality warped under him, and he sank to freedom, the mist man was glad that death was not going to be added to his schedule for the day. After all, he still had a job to do. Assuming his leader had a way to repair his damaged respirator. Izuku shoved the anxious brunette smothering him to the side and retook his aim, only to find that the villain had slipped away during the few precious seconds he'd been distracted. "God fucking damn it," Izuku muttered through teeth clenched in pain. The curse earned a gasp from the anti-gravity girl. Tears began to fill the brunette's eyes as she took in her normally innocent and sweet classmate that now looked frustrated he hadn't been able to commit murder. "Izuku-kun." Okako started, pausing at the incredulity of the idea that the green-haired teen had turned dark so suddenly. "Heroes don't. You shouldn't have stopped him." Cut in 13 through labored breaths. He was about to neutralize the villain that caused all this damage. There was no need to intervene. The brunette turned to her injured teacher, confusion evident on her cherubic face. "Eh? Neutralize?" Okako asked, an inkling of guilt taking hold within her. Not kill? The space hero, trying not to move their body, raised a shaky finger and shook him back and forth in the negative. It was clear the pain from being victimized by their own quirk was slowly sending them into shock. Didn't you notice? 13 asked. Those bullets. There. Capture rounds. Quite innovative. By the way, while the foam bullets were in fact non-lethal in nature, like anything else they could still be used to kill if used correctly. Izuku, being the one who conceptualized them, was better informed than most of that fact. He'd known what he was doing when he'd aimed for the respirator. And it wasn't neutralization. But there wasn't any reason to inform others about that. With the immediate threat gone, the green-haired teen decided to address the next objective that needed seeing to. Tae-chan, Izuku called out to his first partner, who immediately closed the distance to his side. Medkit please. Okako moved to object once again as the zombie girl reached around and pulled out a small box from her supply pack. Surely 13 needed more than a simple medkit? But before the brunette could get 3 words out, her eyes landed on the green-haired teen. More specifically, his physical state. The med. The normally bubbly teen's words caught in her throat. The sight was so horrible. Izuku-kun. Your foot. Ignoring the screams of dismay in favor of opening the kit now held by Tae, Izuku took out what appeared, to his 2 observers, to be protein bars. Just as quickly as he could unwrap it, the green-haired teen wolfed a bar down, hardly stopping to chew. According to Hatsune, by following Inko's recipe, with a few additions courtesy of her own advanced cooking techniques and wonderful babies, the inventor had managed to pack 3 whole days' worth of nutrition into a single bar. Oddly enough, the pinkette had actually immediately advised caution when eating one afterward. Honestly, it was the blandest thing Izuku had ever tasted, but it worked as they'd intended. Almost immediately, the horrible hunger pangs that had plagued the green-haired teen only seconds ago quieted. Only for blinding pain to assault his senses as he felt his right leg begin to rebuild its missing appendage. The hero in training had never lost a limb before, making the sheer agony of first bone, and then muscle, being reconstructed from scratch a new level of suffering for him. Ag. Izuku couldn't contain the scream that burst from his lips, the shooting, searing torment too much coming so unexpectedly. Motherfucker. Ignore the pain. The green-haired teen thought to himself fiercely, turning that same willpower that had allowed him to stand earlier to the task of saving those important to him. For Tsu-chan. For Lily-chan. Okako's mind couldn't process what she was seeing, enough to not even know what to scream. The brunette felt numb, the sight of a pulsating mound of flesh growing where her classmate once had a foot not even making her nauseous. Izuku-kun, here. Izuku grit out, pushing the medkit into Okako's trembling hands. Treat 13's wounds. At first, the brunette was confused, believing that the green-haired teen's pain had muddled what he'd meant to say. Hadn't he intended to say she should treat his wounds, not the pro-heroes? A grunt of pain from her classmate, and a small but visible growth in his leg's mound of flesh, had the anti-gravity girl moving toward their injured teacher without a backward glance. Anything to keep from watching that nightmarish mass of a regenerating foot. Now, where could they have been sent? Izuku pondered, enduring the increasing pain at the end of his leg with gnashed teeth and slow, heavy breaths. As soon as the thought had passed, he felt something like a familiar pull to the left. There. Lily-chan? Turning, Izuku saw the simulated disaster of the landslide zone. Believing in a hunch was iffy at best, but until he had a better, more logical idea, it was the best shot he had. The green-haired teen knew if he could reach the plaza, then he'd have an open view of all of the zones all at once, making noticing the locations of his dear ones that much easier. It'd still be a small chance, but it was better than nothing. Besides, if he could help their gruff teacher out a little, then the chances of everyone surviving would be all the higher. Now, to address his 2 current hindrances. Where exactly is your back 13 sensei? Okako muttered to herself as she unrolled a length of medical tape from the kit. I can't see. Well, I can't see anything inside your suit. Izuku tossed his pistol to the brunette, the well-made tech not even scratching when it struck the ground. Uraraka, I'm leaving this for you, the green-haired teen said, making Okako's eyes grow wide. Hold it firmly with both hands when aiming. And make sure you don't shoot anyone who's not a villain. The anti-gravity girl eyed the gun as if it were the most dangerous artifact in the world. Knowledge of its non-lethal capabilities notwithstanding, the idea of using a weapon was hard for the brunette to grasp. In spite of that hesitation, since directly fighting a horde of villains was beyond her, she'd force herself to use the thing if it came down to it. Where do you think you're going? 13 asked, watching the boy manage to fully stand with the help of his zombie. Aizawa-san said, he said to remain together, Izuku interrupted through gritted teeth. Since that can no longer be accomplished, I'm going to assist him. Our chances of resisting until help arrives will increase if I do. The space hero hated to admit it, but the kid was right. Eraserhead was the only thing keeping the horde of villains down in the plaza from fanning out and picking off their students one by one, and if the man didn't get help soon, even his superb skill would be overcome. Come to think of it, the zombie girl would make for a versatile meat shield down in that mess. Izuku-kun, Okako called out weakly, extending a hand toward the retreating teen. Unfortunately, she lacked the courage to offer her help. 13 raised a gloved hand and patted the brunette's knee from their place on the ground, offering a cold comfort. Let him go, the space hero said, finally accepting this was their best option at the moment. With that disposable meat shield, he's got the best chance at aiding Eraserhead. Izuku nearly cracked a tooth. He clenched his jaw so tight as he stepped up to a now kneeling Tae. The pain didn't cause this, however. The green-haired teen hated how everyone just assumed that Tae was a mere tool. Something to be discarded after use. Gently leaning into the zombie girl's back and wrapping his arms around her neck, the hero in training grumbled as he sank into his angry thoughts. Tae, meanwhile, ensured that the green-haired teen was as comfortable as humanly possible as she reached around and cupped her hands beneath his legs. He deserved nothing less for being a real hero in such a crisis. Elsewhere, in the downpour zone, in the small, dry space provided between a tree and what was left of the wall it fell on, Koji Koda shivered. This wasn't caused by the excessive chill of the never-ending rain, nor was it due to the fact that moments ago when he'd peeked out, the teen had seen over 20 villains coming his way. No. Koda trembled where he sat because of what was about to happen. Out in the perpetual rain, Fumikage Tokoyami stood atop a power line stripped of its load, the height of the structure giving the raven-headed teen all the view he needed of the approaching horde. Keep thy wits about thee, Aoyama, Tokoyami shouted through the storm down to his shaking classmate. The French-Japanese teen looked half frozen to death, but had adamantly sworn he'd stand with his avian classmate. His reason of shining a light of sense on Tokoyami's bête noire should it get out of hand was much appreciated. Our enemy's fast approach. Minutes later, when the group of villains, numbering 27 total now, arrived at the full cul-de-sac their scouts had last seen their prey run toward, they halted their march. Standing at the center of the half-circle of homes, glaring darkly back at them, was a teen with the head of a raven. And what the fuck do you think you're doing, brat? A pot-bellied villain bellowed out, slightly out of breath from all the chasing his crew had done. The raven-headed student only blinked in response. To the surprise of the villains, from the murky shadows of the cul-de-sac came a shining beam of light, no, a laser. Instead of striking anyone in the horde, the shining lance flew over their heads and struck a van that had parked on the curb behind them. The vehicle exploded in a shower of fire and smoke much larger than seemed normal. Before the criminals could react, another laser shot pierced the SUV that had been stationed opposite the van. This vehicle exploded as well, adding even more flames and smoke to the air. Now tense and expecting another attack any second, The villains looked from the now burning blockade, back to the raven-headed teen before them. Nothing about the student had changed, except the unquenchable fires now behind them. He had cast an enormous shadow behind the boy. A shadow. With eyes? Tokoyami raised his arms up, a lonely showman in the howling storm. "Welcome, villains," the raven-headed teen greeted, just as the seemingly harmless shadow behind him literally picked itself off the ground, and towered over the horde. To our dark shadow, emboldened by the unnatural gloominess of the downpour zone and now the heavy shadows caused by the sputtering flames of the vehicle fires, had grown to a massive size. The quirk entity grinned, a glowing crack in its shadowy form so wicked in appearance a few of the villains actually flinched back in raw terror. Tokoyami, feeling he and his partner had set the mood enough, spread his hands wide. Revelry in the dark. Meanwhile in the landslide zone, the group of happenstance consisting of Momo, Jiro, Lily, and unfortunately Mineta were recovering from their slight disorientation on muddy, crumbly terrain. The four appeared to be unhurt, and as much as they thanked the heavens for such a boon, as well as ending up together, the 3 teens plus zombie cursed their luck upon realizing that at least 24 or more villains had surrounded them. "Don't worry, Lily-chan," Momo soothed before declaring with as much conviction as she could muster, "your big sis will protect you." The mature teen hastily created a metal pipe and handed it to Jiro before producing a bow staff for herself. The punk rock girl moved so that she was almost back to back with the creation user, squeezing Lily behind them. The zombie child was understandably terrified of the situation and huddled near the two girls frightfully. "Oh, big bad big sis looks so responsible," one of the villains jeered, taking his time to scan the barely covered, not to mention well-developed, body of the meat before him. "What do you say, boys? Think we can come up with a deal so this one can protect her dear little sister?" Between the wolf whistles, laughs, and openly disgusting leering, Jiro had never been more gratefully that her body hadn't hit the puberty jackpot. At the same time, the punk rock girl knew that dubious benefit only went so far, and had to fight the nauseous feeling that came at the very thought of what would happen next if the two of them proved unable to prevail in the coming battle. "And maybe YUSH should," stuttered Mineta, the midget inching closer to Jiro's leg. "I'll let them play with you, wham." Predicting what the little pervert was about to suggest, Jiro wasted no time in knocking him out with a strike to the head. Honestly, the punk rock girl wondered why Momo even went through the trouble of removing the solidified foam from the midget's mouth. It had proved to be quite a waste of nail cleaner. "It's do or die, Yamamo," Jiro said, sliding into a battle stance. She gave a quick glance back to make sure Lily was still with him before deciding to sandwich the zombie girl between herself and the more developed girl for more protection. "I got your back." Lily watched with fear as the circle of villains tightened around her group. The criminals all looked so intimidating, so evil. The littlest zombie wished her new big brother was here, but didn't blame him for her current situation. There was no way anyone could have predicted this. She knew he'd come for them though, she'd seen him trying to reach her before they'd been separated by the Misty Man. "What am I supposed to do?" Lily wailed in her mind, trying her hardest to come up with a way she could help. If she hadn't already been deathly pale, she knew her knuckles would be white with how tightly she was clutching the object in her tiny hands. "Ani-chan said I was meant to be support." And then, Lily actually looked at what she was holding. The sturdy and not cute in the slightest SMG. When her new big brother had explained to the little zombie what support meant, he described it as someone who helped others by making their jobs easier. This was usually accomplished by cheering them up, passing them tools they required, being helpful and caring, and if the need arose, sharing their burdens and assisting with their job. The weapon in her hands was a non-lethal capture tool, meant to slow down and incapacitate bad guys. It could also be applied as sealing foam, when needed, against cracks in walls or support columns. If she could use it to impede the criminals, even a little, Lily believed she'd give her new big sisters a much easier time fighting to protect her. "Come on, Lily." The littlest zombie psyched herself up by shouting in her head, "This is just like an action movie. Just another stage." From the back of the congregated villains, a larger and more menacing form stepped forward. The other criminals swiftly gave way to this newcomer. "All right, boss?" The large rogue boomed, calling the attention of his peers. "Looks like there's several holes that need filling and we don't have any time to low. Rat-ta-ta-ta-ta." The sound of rapid gunfire filled the zone, causing the approaching villains to cringe back and freeze. That is, except for their big gun, who was now covered in quickly expanding and hardening foam. In seconds, he fell to the ground, unable to move or escape. The fuck was that? Wham! The uncouth villain's next words were lost to the voluptuous girl who swung her bowstaff full force into his head. Next to drop was the criminal beside him, who dropped, like a sack of potatoes, to an around-the-back spin of the staff to his groin. The well-developed teen stood over her quarry with a fierce glare directed at the remaining criminals, the fire in her eyes a telling sign as to how difficult they would find it to bring her down. "Women we may be," Momo stated, spinning her bowstaff a few times, "but we are not defenseless flowers to be plucked." Lily held her weapon at the ready, gladly utilizing the fact that her undead body would not tremble in fear. She took a step to the side, no longer under the cover of Jiro's shadow. "Lily is a hero now too," the zombie girl shouted, taking aim at a random villain. "Lily can fight." Jiro smirked at the displays of courage her fellow ladies were giving. She couldn't let a call to battle like those go unanswered. The punk rock girl tightened her grip on her pipe, ready to defend her friends against the filth that dared stand against them. Although she kind of wished Tokoyami and Midoriya were with them, the two dark boys would have easily scared the ever-loving shit out of the trash they were fighting. Meanwhile, at the plaza, still pushing full throttle, Aizawa felt as if he'd been knocking out villains for hours. The veritable carpet of dozens of unconscious bodies littering the ground paid credence to this thought, but the pro hero knew it was just in his head. The fighting wasn't even what was stressing him out the most, to be honest, nor was it his depleting stamina or the ever-worsening itch in his sore eyes. No, what worried the gruff teacher the most was that he lost sight of the one invader that had concerned him most. He'd only taken his gaze off the fountain for an instant, but it had been enough for the mist villain to disappear. In his gut, the pro hero knew his students were now in trouble, and he couldn't do shit to help them at the moment. Damn it. Aizawa cursed under his breath, unable to spare even a second to check on his kids. Why are these idiots so damn persistent? Movement by the fountain caught the embattled pro hero's attention, and he turned his head. From a hastily closing tear in reality, the mist villain had reappeared. Looking severely injured and short of breath, Aizawa immediately cursed again, a young woman with skin covered in reptilian scales like a snake's taking her shot to get by him. The gruff teacher threw a roundhouse kick at the villainess, but the woman contorted her body around his leg like it was second nature and kept her momentum going. She was almost to the stairs. Boom. It was an incredibly loud and bright flash that erupted in the woman's face, not only stopping her dead in her tracks but also sending her flailing backwards. When she landed, the villainess appeared to already be unconscious, though the wretched look on her face screamed pain. The villains that had remained standing so far froze, gazing with no small amount of fear at the two new arrivals now standing at the bottom of the stairs. One, a green-haired runt riding on the back of an extremely pale girl, held a brutal-looking shotgun in one hand. Midoriya. Aizawa addressed his problem child, using the momentary respite only the natural fear of a shotgun could produce to his advantage. "What's happening?" "Sit rep." Tay gently bent down, unloading Izuku by the stairs, before taking up a defensive stance between him and the villains. As Aizawa looked over his student for injuries, his bloodshot eyes landed on the pulsating mound of flesh that was growing from where the green-haired teen once had a right foot. The pro hero immediately knew there was no good news awaiting him. "Situation went to shit, sir," Izuku reported flatly, pumping a new round into his shotgun's chamber. The maneuver successfully caused the villains to flinch back again, gaining them a few more precious seconds. The mist villain took us by surprise. Mashiro Ojiro and Ejiro Kirishima attempted to intercept, but his warp quirk scattered them and most of the rest of my classmates across the facility regardless. I failed my mission. We failed, Midoriya, Aizawa corrected, quick to shoulder the blame. It was unfair to allow the team to believe he was solely responsible. I was distracted for a second. But that was enough for the villain to manage to reach you. The tired pro hero quietly wondered to himself when getting distracted would stop resulting in those close to him getting hurt, a memory of blood-soaked seafoam hair flashing before his mind's eye. Aizawa pushed the ever-present guilt down, retaking his battle stance. The pro-hero absently noted that the zombie girl was now by his side, growling menacingly at the villains. The way the undead wielded her crowbar spoke of broken bones for whoever ended up in her sights. Space Hero 13 was also injured in a skirmish, but their life's not in immediate danger. Izuku continued his report while taking aim at a villain who twitched. I had Okakoyuraraki attend their wounds and stand guard up there while I came down here to provide any assistance I could. We have a better chance of surviving until backup arrives this way. Boom. The villain didn't twitch, again. Backup? The gruff teacher asked, marveling at the effectiveness of the non-lethal ammunition. As his homeroom teacher, he'd been given access and inclination to read all of the specs for Izuku's weapons, but still. The pro-hero was extremely glad he'd allowed the green-haired teen to bring his inventions to the rescue trial. Tenya Ida managed to escape the building with support from Te. Izuku's speech pattern finally caught Aizawa's attention. The green-haired teen wasn't sounding like himself, but with the current crisis underway, there wasn't time to analyze the possible issue. The pro-hero filed the observation away for later though. Perhaps a visit to Hound Dog would do the boy some good after this? I'd rather you return upstairs. Aizawa tried, before noticing the remaining villains had finally gathered enough courage to renew their assault. The green-haired teen merely lowered his weapon in response, not batting an eye. That option is no longer available, sir, Izuku declared, citing a target. Te, cover sensei. Avoid breaking his sight line. Te's responding grunt and nod were quite the reassurance to the gruff teacher. Now, as he was forced into the fight once more, he knew that any that managed to sneak by him would have the unlucky fate of facing off against a remorseless undead with inhuman strength. And a crowbar. Izuku wasn't being completely honest with his teacher. While it was true he fully intended to provide fire support, his true intention was still to scan the surrounding areas. No doubt he wasn't the only one who'd noticed the spectacle caused by the surging electricity coming from the flood zone, Kaminari's handiwork no doubt. The display probably meant the aquatic villains were taken care of for now, but more importantly the green-haired teen knew for a fact that the easygoing blonde wouldn't have been able to come up with a response like that on his own. And while he wasn't one to disparage his classmates, Kaminari also wasn't one to be courageous enough to pull off a stunt like that by himself. Which meant he'd been assisted. Only 3 names came to Izuku's mind, only 3 people who were capable of not only literally throwing their classmate to the sharks, but also would do so knowing it would be the best solution. Tsuyasui, Fumikage Tokoyami, and Kyau Kajiro. Keeping an eye on the flood zone, the green-haired teen expected to see any one of these 3 appearing any minute, poking their heads up from the faux shoreline. If it turned out to be Jiro or Tokoyami, he'd team up with them to find Tsu and Lily. And if by some miracle it was Tsu he saw. Tsu-chan. The name almost sang through Izuku's mind, his heart flipping in his chest. There. At the edge of the zone, right where he'd predicted, he could just make out the small figure of the beautiful frog girl, herding a wasted blonde to dry land. The green-haired teen scanned the area, watching as Eraserhead and Tay made short work of another group of the amassed villains. Taking the moment as his best chance to leave, Izuku vaulted over the stairs handrail. The landing amongst the bushes was painful, but he sucked it up and proceeded to move as fast and silently as his newly reforming foot allowed. Back by the fountain, Tamura Shigaraki watched the pitched battle between the grunts he'd managed to scrap together and the underground hero, now supported by some militarily dressed woman. While he did so, his hands were busy helping his ticket out of this shithole. "That is the one?" Shigaraki asked, decaying more of the foam that was suffocating the mist villain. "Doesn't seem too bright." Still unable to shake his head, the debilitated villain waved away the observation with a hand. "I don't think. She's a student," the mist villain replied through labored breaths. "Maybe. Part of the staff." Shigaraki chuckled at the news, decaying the last of the foam with his quirk. "A spike in difficulty then," the handsy villain said, an unseen but deranged smile on his face. "Take a moment for your cooldown to finish, Kurogiri, and watch how I break the game." Aizawa hated to admit it, but he was at his limit. He couldn't keep his quirk activated long enough to be effective, and it was only the uncertainty his goggles gave his opponents that was keeping many from openly attacking with their own. The gruff teacher would admit though, having a zombie girl at his back was making things easier. Even so, he was beginning to allow more villains to reach her, something he couldn't afford. And as reliable as the zombie girl was turning out to be, the level of autonomy she showed still bothered the pro hero. There was no hesitation to attack, no pauses before assisting him, but it was clear to anyone with eyes that the undead was showing signs of emotion, of anger. Her inhuman strength, while strictly non-lethal, was so barely contained it was a pretty sure bet that a couple of the villains she'd struck would never walk again. "Wait. Where's the giant one?" Aizawa panicked, having turned to look at the fountain for a second. To his left, he heard the sickening sounds of bones snapping. The large beast man thing had inexplicably appeared beside the zombie girl. Without even a hint of effort, the monster backhanded her with enough force it sent a shockwave through the air. The sight of the girl being flung through the air like a ragdoll by a blow that would have killed any living hero without a reinforcement quirk distracted Aizawa for a second. And once again, that second's distraction led to his suffering. "Game over, hero," Shigaraki announced behind his face hand, holding the elbow of the gruff teacher. In seconds, the joint decayed to the point it was extremely close to showing bone. Aizawa grunted at the pain, barely containing a full-blown scream of agony. Cocking his free arm back for an unavoidable counterattack, the gruff teacher found he couldn't move it. Bewildered, the pro-hero looked back. The monster had appeared behind him and enveloped his arm in its beastly grip. With an effortless twist, Eraserhead's good arm was shattered, leaving him at the mercy of the villains. On the shore of the flood zone, Sa watched appalled as her homeroom teacher was mauled by the terrifying man-beast. It had been horrible enough to see Tae-chan, in all her kick-ass battle glory, be thrown away like that, her body broken, but at least she hadn't had to worry about the zombie girl dying from it. Aizawa-sensei though. "Yay!" Kaminari blurted out, his brain still fried. Sa only covered his drooling mouth with her hand in response. Thinking better of that, and the drool she might get on her, she dropped her burned-out classmate against a convenient boulder and took a few hesitant steps toward the plaza. The frog girl hated to admit it, but there was nothing she could do at the moment save pray for a miracle. Unbidden tears began to form, leaking trails of sorrow as she was forced to watch the signature goggles of her sensei being ripped off his face without a care and thrown away. Then everything only got worse. The monster, using only a single hand, began to smash Aizawa's head against the concrete. The resulting sight and sounds of a skull cracking and blood spurting was a heartbreaking scene to witness. It was a sad reminder that villains never played by the rules. "Tamura." Kurogiri spoke lowly from the ground, an unspoken warning in his worried tone. The mist villain still hadn't managed to gather the strength to join the fight. At least he could breathe easier now. The handsy villain only scoffed from where he stood, rather enjoying the sight of the underground hero being reduced to fleshy mulch. I know. The brat escaped. The cavalry's probably on its way as we speak, Shigaraki eventually answered, still watching the man-beast maul the pro-hero. If you weren't our way out, I'd kill you for that, by the way. Tsu barely managed it, but she'd heard the short exchange between the villains. For a moment, the frog girl believed that was it. Maybe they'd leave without inflicting more pain, without taking any lives. It seems we weren't enough of a lure for All Might after all. Shigaraki continued, disappointment clear from his tone. Then, much to Tsu's horror, the villain turned to stare directly at her. But let's leave a couple dead kids as a gift anyway. The overwhelming nature of the malevolence held in the lanky villain's gaze was something Tsu had never experienced before. It caused her body to freeze in dread and her heart to catch in her throat. In that instant, the frog girl knew how she was going to die. She'd seen what happened to her sensei when the villain had grabbed his arm. Shigaraki leapt at his newest victim, wide-open hand aimed at touching the short girl's face. He was feeling so euphoric at the idea of how All Might would react to seeing his students' dead bodies. His hidden maniacal grin nearly caused his dried lips to bleed. Izuku. Tsu watched as her life flashed before her eyes, years of love and adversity that had made her who she was passing by in a blink. Then, her vision settled on a new scene. Not a memory, but an unbidden wish. It was an elopement. An older version of her stood in a rather plain office with two shadowy witnesses behind her as a grown and dreamy-looking cinnamon roll signed his half of the marriage papers with a red seal bearing his name. They were both smiling. Such warm smiles of love. I know. Izuku's scream reverberated through the area as he shoved Tsu down out of harm's way, taking her place as Shigaraki's hand landed exactly where he'd aimed it, just on an unexpected target. The frog girl could only watch with ice in her veins as the villain took a firm grasp of her savior's face and... Even behind the dismembered hand covering him, Shigaraki's poorly hidden surprise was clear to see. There was no dust. No decay. Taking a chance, the white-haired psychopath took a quick glance at Eraserhead to see if the underground hero had pulled off one last surprise. But the pro-hero was still being held down face first by his bestial assailant. There was no interference from that quirk going on. Instead, there was only an awkward moment of silence as the murderous villain stared dumbfounded at the first person he'd ever encountered that hadn't disintegrated at his touch. Surprise! Izuku hissed out as he pumped a round into his weapons chamber, causing the unlucky Sanuvabich man handling his face to glance down at the shotgun now pointed at his own. Motherfucker! Boom. Shigaraki was blasted at point-blank range. The flare of the miniature explosion nearly blinded him, the thunderous bellow nearly deafened him, and the sheer force that launched him backwards into the air rattled his brain so hard he wasn't able to tell up from down. Landing a handful of seconds later, the villain just barely managed to hang on to consciousness. Instantaneously, the man-beast crushing Aizawa released its grip on his head, appearing between the downed Shigaraki and the heroes in training. Its dead-eyed gaze stared straight ahead while it performed its second-to-primary mission. For a split second, looking up at him as he stood guard over her, some could have sworn Izuku shone with a glowing halo around his curly-haired head. Once again he'd come to her rescue like a gallant hero, this time blasting away the villain that had intended to end her life. Even the large weapon her savior wielded complemented his current level of badassery perfectly. And then he stumbled, struggling to remain standing even when he used the shotgun as a crutch. Izuku. Tsu had never moved so quickly in her life as when she raced to Izuku's side, keeping him standing. Something immediately worried the frog girl, something that she shouldn't be able to feel just by having her arms wrapped around him in support. "You're burning with fever." The shout, while well-intended, pushed the injured Shigaraki over the edge. He was in agony and those damn kids were worried over a little high temperature? He'd give them something to cry about. "No, Namu." Shigaraki wheezed from where he lay, the world still spinning. "Kill those damn kids." The Namu's head snapped toward the only two kids it could see, and an instant later, it was upon them. Everything seemed lost for the heroes in training. Crash. Then the gates of the USJ facility exploded inward. From the resulting dust cloud stepped the heroic form of All Might. I am here. The symbol of peace had arrived. But there was no perpetual smile to be seen on his face. Instead, there was only a bone-chilling scowl of rage. Magnus. Next chapter is the conclusion of these fights. You can be sure they're going to leave quite the impressions. Chapter 13, a sinister counterattack. All Might was seeing red. Throughout his storied career as the symbol of peace, and even before as he climbed the ladder to such a lofty position, he'd faced every kind of villain imaginable. He'd taken down white-collar types that preferred to act through clean and quick operations. He'd set straight misguided youths who'd never been shown their power came with responsibility. He'd squared off against the dirtiest filth imaginable that only wanted to see the world burn. But at that very moment, he was facing the type of villain he considered his personal worst. One that specifically aimed for those under his care. How dare you? All Might growled, his electrifying blue eyes quickly catching sight of an injured 13 being aided by a fearful Uraraka, but none of his other students. Stepping forward, the mighty pro hero almost snarled when he recognized the bloodied form of Aizawa at the bottom of the stairs. Okako had never had to try so hard to keep from crying. The number one hero had finally arrived, and the brunette kept repeating that fact to herself to stave off the tears. Everything would be alright now. It had to be. Down in the plaza, Sa couldn't care less that All Might had arrived, though it did register with her. The only thing occupying the frog girl's mind at that moment was the fact that her cinnamon roll was currently fighting to remain conscious, and he was burning up. So, the final boss has finally appeared, Shigaraki said as he tried to stand. His legs still felt weak, and it felt like his brain was throbbing. We can't very well run away now without giving it a shot, can we? The moment he managed to stand up straight without wobbling, the handsy villain was immediately thrown back to the ground, this time by the shockwave caused by a massive blur moving at such inhuman speeds even his face hand lost its grip and flew off his face. Scrambling to his knees, Shigaraki saw that even Namu had been thrown off balance as the blur passed by in less than a heartbeat's time. Yay? The still derped Kaminari asked from his place by the bottom of the stairs, now sitting next to Tsu and Izuku, the two having been deposited at the short-circuited blonde's side by the blur. Before the three stood All Might, the symbol of peace cradling them all, Aizawa in his arms as gently as his muscular form allowed. The great hero's head was bowed at the sight of the man he held. Aizawa-kun. All Might nearly whispered, his heart almost breaking as he took in the horribly mangled face of his co-worker and realized he wouldn't be getting a response. I'm so sorry I'm late. The faintest of rasping breaths gave only the barest of comforts that the underground hero was still alive. The gruesome and extensive damage, however, threatened even that boon. Izuku-kun. Tsu was similarly breaking apart at the moment due to the state of the boy she'd come to love. A love she'd still yet to voice. Please. Now away from the infested waters of the shipwreck zone and no longer fearing for her life, Tsu was able to take the time to take stock of the injuries that plagued her cinnamon roll. The still pulsating, half-formed foot was the most grisly of his visible wounds, if only because it still lacked skin to cover all muscle. There were also numerous scars of varying depths that had yet to fully heal. And that's when the frog girl's chaotic thoughts sparked an epiphany. It was no wonder Izuku had such a horrible fever. His regeneration must have finally hit a hard limit. Gently supporting the green-haired teen's head in her lap, Tsu noticed more evidence to support her hypothesis. There were white spots in her cinnamon roll's hair, locks that had been half disintegrated when the handsy villain had tried to kill him. And since his glasses had fallen off, when All Might had moved them, the frog girl could see his eyes were flickering between her beloved emeralds and ominous rubies. Izuku's blood couldn't keep up. Stay here and move them to safety when you can, All Might ordered as he carefully laid Aizawa by his students. I'll take care of the rest. The number one hero turned away to face the remaining villains, completely missing the glare, from the frog girl. Some held her tongue, fearing that if she spoke her blunt nature would blurt out something regrettable to the pro-hero. Instead, she busied herself with comforting her savior any way she could, even if it was just threading her gloved fingers through his hair. Seeing that All Might was no longer watching them, Izuku began to squirm, palming his pants pocket. Some noticed the action immediately, and helped the green-haired teen pull out what was inside, a protein bar. There was no doubt in the frog girl's mind her savior was probably feeling starved, his quirk needing additional nutrients to get back to full power. Here, some murmured, feeling guilty that Izuku was most likely in his current position because he'd overtaxed his quirk to save her from certain death. Again. Please. Heal. As Izuku began to scarf down the bar, Sa took the opportunity to turn her attention to the confrontation unfurling before them. With her savior in such bad shape, someone needed to be his eyes in case he required information for planning. If anyone could improve their chances of survival besides All Might, it'd be the green-haired teen and his mind. All Might, taking steps that cracked the very ground he strode upon, had now reached the lanky villain. The symbol of peace had walked right around the man-beast, the monster appearing to be in a daze and unaware of what was happening. Father? Father? Shigaraki screamed, noticing a familiar weight was missing from his face. Collapsing to the ground, he crawled with one arm toward the dismembered appendage, the other covering his unmasked appearance. Upon reaching the hand, Shigaraki tenderly picked it up. The action caused All Might to pause, the unexpected emotion throwing the pro-hero off. Father. I'm so sorry. Shigaraki muttered, dusting off the severed limb. Satisfied he'd done what he could, he placed the hand back over his face. The lanky villain then turned to the symbol of peace, a truly psychotic look in his one visible red eye. Such willful violence, as should be expected from a government agent, Shigaraki proclaimed, standing through the pain racking his body. It's no wonder that Brat felt the need to blast my face with a shotgun. All Might kept his face passive, but internally he was appalled by the idea one of his students was using firearms. At least he knew that if Aizawa had allowed their use, they must have been modified to be non-lethal. Deciding to file that information away for later, the number one hero turned his attention back to the job at hand, saving everyone. Is that what us teaching kids nowadays? The lanky villain continued on, barely withholding his glee at being able to stab the symbol of peace's pride. Violence of any kind is acceptable, as long as it's against villains? Sounds to me like the system's corrupt and needs a reboot. You speak as if you're a white collar, like your actions are justifiable and deserve no retaliation. All Might rebutted, knowing full well the kind of person he was dealing with, the pain and suffering he'd already caused. But the truth is you don't believe a word of it. You're nothing more than a deranged psychopath who's thoroughly enjoying all of this madness. Shigaraki laughed. He couldn't help it. So his psychological play hadn't worked out. He couldn't care less. He still had a job to do, and a game to break. Feeling that she'd seen enough, Sa returned her focus to helping Izuku recover, safe in the knowledge that All Might would never fail them. After all, no matter how small, there had to be something that she could do to help the green-haired teen. Her savior had just about polished off the gross-looking bar, and while the white spots in his hair had disappeared, his fever hadn't lessened at all. Izuku-kun. Sa whispered softly, holding back her tears and growing fear. She refused to fall apart. Her cinnamon roll didn't need a damsel in distress, he needed a capable partner. In response to the gentle words, Izuku cupped one of the frog girl's cheeks with a tender hand. I'm here. The green-haired teen weakly responded, his eyes finally settling back to their original emerald. The hero in training had no way of knowing how thankful the girl whose lap he laid in was for that. Before Sa could lose her grip on her emotions, a bottle of water miraculously rolled up to her feet. Looking around, the frog girl quickly spotted the culprit, a still mangled Tay. The zombie girl, who'd managed to regenerate an arm back to working order, seemed focused on crawling back to her master. And even then, As broken as her body was, she'd still managed to dig out and throw them one of the few supplies that had survived the vicious attack against her. "I hope she's not in pain," Sa said as she opened the bottle. Figuring Izuku might be thirsty as well as hungry, she turned to hand it to him. Only for the green-haired teen to snatch the water from her hands and pour it over his head. Bewildered, Sa looked back to Tae, though the sight was beginning to churn her stomach. As much as she could praise the zombie girl's determination in the face of adversity, the idea of enduring such a state was simply unimaginable. Even the wounds she'd received during the battle trial attack hadn't compared to that. "I needed that," Izuku gasped out, as if the water had been ice cold. "We need to, move." The green-haired teen's grunt came on the heels of his foot resuming its regeneration, a sure sign the second protein bar had already begun to kick in. Sa, taking her savior's hand in support, truly didn't feel like moving was the best idea for the injured cinnamon roll. However, she also knew that staying so close to a battlefield carried even worse odds for further injury. With a firm nod, the frog girl prepared herself to help carry the green-haired teen, and somehow their mauled teacher, to the stairs. That was, until Izuku grabbed her arm. "Not that way." The hero in training grit out, turning to face the landslide zone. "That way. Lily-chan is that way." "Lily-chan?" Sa cried, understandably worried. The adorable zombie girl was probably scared out of her mind at the horrible situation she found herself in, undead condition notwithstanding. A sharp, rattling intake of breath broke both teens from their concerned thoughts. "Me. Do. Ria," came the unexpected voice of their beaten teacher. "Heal. Me." Aghast, the green duo stared wide-eyed at each other, each unsure of what they'd just heard. Surely Aizawa hadn't said, "Sensei?" Sa asked on behalf of a shaken Izuku, knowing this might overtax his quirk again. "You said, all might. Don't. Ow." Aizawa's words were slurred and spoken through a mouthful of blood, making them even harder to understand for the frog girl. Then Izuku shook himself from his stupor and filled in the blanks. "All might. Doesn't know?" The green-haired teen probed, now looking much better. His flushed cheeks still spoke of an unbroken fever though. Sa stood in awe, amazed that her savior had been able to understand such garbled language so easily. My. As Aizawa's power of speech slipped away, Izuku's eyes widened at his teacher's warning. It was just like one of the scenarios he'd thought up. One of the invading villains had a quirk that specifically countered All Might. But that couldn't be the whole plan though, otherwise why attack the USJ? Why not at any other time? There had to be something else. Perhaps a combination of quirks, from numerous villains? "I understand, Sensei." Izuku acquiesced in the face of such a threat. The green-haired teen took out his trademark penknife, only for the blade to slip from his weakened hands. Izuku almost missed the blunder, his mind already reimagining the scenario in his head. The man-beast, with its massive strength, would most likely be used to hold All Might locked in place for a short period of time. That was all that would be needed for the Hanzi villain to capitalize on the opportunity and aim for disintegrating the number one hero. Or parts of him. Even just taking out All Might's size would render him crippled, the same for losing an arm or leg. Any such wound would surely cause the pro-hero's downfall. That meant there was no time to waste. To help All Might, Aizawa needed to rise again. "Izuku no," Sa said forcefully, nearly shouting as she reached for the tiny knife. Her savior couldn't lose any more blood. Izuku intercepted the grasping hand with a gentle yet firm hold. Looking up, the frog girl locked eyes with the green-haired teen. "Tsu-chan," Izuku said, voice solemn. "I need you to draw my blood. It's the only way to save Carolina." Smash! The resonant battle cry of one of All Might's signature moves caught both teens' attention. Before the eyes of every conscious witness, All Might shot toward the lanky villain, arms crossed in an X shape. But the instant before the attack landed, the man-beast appeared between the pro-hero and his target, tanking the entire blow. The mightiest hero's attack was rendered completely ineffective. What the? All Might's shock at his strength failing so spectacularly was cut short as he was forced to bend backwards to avoid a grapple from the monstrous villain. Using his momentum, the number one hero backflipped to gain some distance between himself and this unexpected factor. Tsu turned back to her savior, her heart breaking. The thought of him hurting was untenable, but seeing the symbol of peace struggle against the man-beast confirmed there was no real alternative. Swallowing her reluctance down, the frog girl helped Izuku over to their severely injured teacher. Picking up the penknife, Tsu raised the blade to cut into the wrist of her beloved cinnamon roll. Meanwhile, in the landslide zone, Lily took a moment, in between shooting up villains, to watch as Momo and Jiro laid into their foes with head or groan strikes. Her big sisters were devastating with their staff and pipe, and already over a dozen criminals were either unconscious from head trauma or crumpled in pain holding their smashed privates. Quite a few had fallen victim to her surprising skill with the SMG, resulting in a half-dozen winding up as cocoons of foam. That left just a half-dozen evildoers to deal with before they won. We can do this. Anai-chan is going to be so proud of Lily. Lily thought excitedly as she took aim at another villain. The littlest zombie always took care to aim for the most dangerous-looking ones, or any that got close to or behind her big sisters. Unfortunately, click click click, Lily almost dropped her Tulin horror. Of course it would run out of ammo, it had only been meant as a prototype test model. Actual, full combat was far beyond the thing's capabilities. The villain Lily had been aiming for took notice that his aggressor was in a predicament, and took the chance to bull rush her. Panicking, the little zombie girl pulled a desperate move. She threw the SMG at the charging villain. Full force. Wham! The criminal dropped like a rock, unable to even cry out in pain. Lily had completely forgotten the fact that her muscles could now generate truly brutal levels of strength, definitely more than when she'd been alive. Nice aim, Lily-chan. Jiro cheered as she bent yet another villain, leaving only 4 to be taken down. Retreat, Lily-chan. Momo shouted immediately after, taking down another criminal and dropping the countdown to 3. Let your big sisters protect you now. Lily was only too happy to agree, nodding and backing away from the remaining attackers. She had faith in the skills of her new big sisters. Then she felt it. Something was tugging at her. Anai-chan. Lily murmured, turning to look toward the plaza. She could feel it. The source of her unlife. He was suffering. Fighting. Anai-chan needs me. The littlest zombie stepped in the direction of the plaza, only for an unseen force to yank her up by the hair hard enough for her feet to leave the ground. Okay, that's enough, bitches. The empty air behind Lily shifted as Momo and Jiro froze, the vague impression of a woman discernible from the refracted light. The spotty invisibility flickered once more before ending, revealing it was indeed a female villain that had snatched the little zombie girl by her hair. The criminal had long and thick tendril-like hair that fell limply around her, and although it was now black in color, the two heroines in training had seen the mane as it shimmered into sight as their foe's quirk lost power. Drop your weapons or the pipsqueak here won't live to even dream of puberty, the villainess threatened, wrenching Lily closer to her rough figure. Lily-chan. Momo screamed. The sheer anguish the mature girl felt for allowing some filthy villain to touch her adorable little sister was plain to see on her horror-stricken face. The villainous Tsukedashi wagged a finger at the teens before her. Using that same finger, and the sharpened nail that tipped it, she dragged it down her captive's face in a macabre imitation of a soothing gesture. Didn't you hear me? The villainess taunted, torturously moving her talon-like fingernail closer to her captive's mouth. Drop your weapons and let the boys here play with you. Or you can stand there as I show this little runt how to have a good time. Momo trembled, unprepared for the severity of her first hostage situation. Her usually brilliant mind refused to think straight, and no strategies to get out of their current situation came to her. Reluctantly, and not a little fearful, the mature girl loosened her grip on her bow staff. If it was to save her little sister, you fucking moron. Let go of her now. Jiro's sudden shout knocked Momo from her defeatist thoughts. Although it wasn't because of the words said. No, what struck Momo was the strange urgency that colored the punk rock girl's voice. Almost like a warning. Someone skipped her etiquette lessons, the villainess mocked, before lightening her voice to an almost sing-song quality. And someone definitely forgot their position here. The woman's hand stopped right by her captive's mouth, talon nails ready to give these goody two-shoes a crash course in the harsh realities of the world of heroes and villains. It might not physically scar them as much as her own had, but it would sure leave just as many mental scars. And that was when Momo understood the reason behind the near-frantic warning tone in Jiro's demand. Lily felt so angry she was literally seeing red. Lily now had a mission to fulfill, reach her big brother and help him, and this shitty waste of a sack of flesh was daring to slow her down? Lily felt the sharp fingers as they poked her mouth, and that's when instinct and nightmarish trauma overrode all reasoning. For a moment, Lily lost touch with the adorable little girl she'd been, the one that won the hearts of most of her big brother's class. For a single moment, the mask dropped, and Lily embraced what she truly was. A zombie. Chomp. Gah. The scream that tore from the villainous lips was not only ear-piercing, but blood-curdling. The remaining villains, who'd moved to Titan rank while their prey was preoccupied, now paused in shock. But it was the mangled, blood-spurting hand of their compatriot that left them utterly petrified. The villainess threw the little cannibal away in a knee-jerk reaction in hopes of avoiding further injury. But the little freak only landed squarely on her feet, as if she were some kind of combat expert. Lily turned from her new position and glared at the obstacle in between her and her big brother. Coating her lips and chin was a crimson river, and to the dread of those watching, they knew it wasn't from her. In a thoughtless act of horror, the little zombie girl spat out two very bloody human fingers. Upon realizing the discarded extremities were hers, the villainess screamed again, her pain-filled mind panicking at the undeniable proof of her disfigurement. "Stay away from me!" the frightened woman shrieked as she backpedaled. She had to get away from the thing that had been masquerading as a little girl, the thing that glared at her with such unflinching rage. "You monster!" In a frantic act of desperation, the villainess thought to activate her quirk. If she could disappear, she would have the chance to escape the cause of her suffering. Or cause a little bit of suffering herself. Unfortunately for the unlucky woman, Lily decided that the best way to stop any more obstacles from standing between her and her big brother was to do something she'd been told would only ever harm her. Use her quirk. While, on paper the ability sounded incredible, it was a double-edged sword. With the power to bring down emitter types instantly came the drawback of only being able to use it for a second before the internal damage to herself began to get serious. But that had been when she'd been alive. When things hurt. Before her big brother made all her pain go away. So, the littlest zombie opened her mouth and screeched. The high-frequency screech that erupted from Lily's small mouth was so unbelievably powerful, the ground at her feet instantly cracked from the force of the sound waves. But that wasn't all that the scream was going to do. The villainess, who'd been in the process of using her light-refracting locks to disappear, immediately became visible again as she dropped to the ground. The woman clutched at her ears, but the relentless sound drilled into her head regardless. Not even 2 seconds later, she started to convulse in agony. The other villains that still remained, all sharing the misfortune of being emitter types as well, dropped like marionettes with their strings cut. They uttered no cries, made no attempts at escape. Their forms only trembled, their mouths foaming. After 5 seconds, the screech cut off. Utterly shocked at the effect of the little zombie girl's quirk, Jiro waited until even the echoes of the attack were gone before uncovering her ears. The punk rock girl was beyond glad that years of living with a musically inclined family had trained her instincts to protect her hearing like it was second nature. It didn't hurt that earphone jack gave her audio nerves both a major boost and a minor healing factor. That was. Jiro trailed off, blinking at the reality of the three of them having won. So metal. 5 seconds of Lily's scream had devastated the villains, even appearing to affect some of their previously immobilized foes. But then, Jiro finally noticed all was not well. Momo had dropped to her knees. And she was shaking. "Yeah, Momo!" Jiro shouted, rushing to her friend's side. Just as she sunk down to her partner's side, the mature girl began to throw up, face scrunched in pain. "Are you all right?" Momo made no effort to reply, nor did she act as if she'd even heard Jiro's question. It was quickly becoming apparent that whatever Lily had done, it had also affected the class president. As gently as she could, the punk rock girl helped the mature girl into the recovery position on the ground, away from her own vomit. When that was done, the only thing left she could think to do was to check on the zombie girl. "Lily?" Jiro called out when she saw the little girl hadn't moved from where she'd unleashed hell. The punk rock girl was slightly on guard. She'd now seen what could happen if Izuku's zombies decided to bite. "How are you holding up?" When Lily didn't immediately respond, Jiro feared that being separated from Izuku for so long had negatively affected the undead. Had reverting to a feral state been the result of needing her green-haired classmate to function like a normal person? Without speaking a word, Lily turned back to look in the direction of the plaza. She took a step forward and fell face first to the ground. "Lily!" Jiro forgot her fears of being bitten the second she saw Lily fall, running to pick up and cradle the precious little girl in her arms. "What's happening?" "Lily is so tired," Lily answered slowly, making jerking movements. It was a terrifying moment for the punk rock girl, watching as the now dull-eyed zombie girl fought herself, as it became harder and harder to move with each passing second. "Lily needs a Nyai-chan." Jiro followed the little zombie's pointing finger, immediately understanding that Lily needed to get to Izuku to get better. Unfortunately, she couldn't just leave Momo near passed out surrounded by villains, regardless of whether or not they'd already been downed. She'd never be able to live with herself if some pervert managed to wake up before the class president was able to stand on her own. Meanwhile, in the downpour zone. At first, everything had been going well. After Aoyama had succeeded in sniping the vehicles, the flames had caused more than enough shadow, and with his superb acting skills Tokoyami had had the villains cowering in fear. The cowards had barely been able to resist dark, shadow-sweeping attacks, let alone even think about targeting his two classmates whose quirks were currently disadvantageous. Then, things had begun to go south. Gah ha 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 ha. The wickedly boisterous laughter of the assault group's newest leader overpowered even the relentless drumbeats of the rain. "You're nothing but smoke and mirrors, boy." The large villain, who had 3 arms that were as big around as tree trunks, swung his chainsaw sword at the raven-headed teen with reckless abandon. Each swing made its way ever closer to eviscerating the student. Dark Shadow tried to run interference, but it wasn't helping as much as it should have. This worrisome development occurred through no fault of Tokoyami's own. At mid-range, the avian teen should have been considered virtually invincible. Dark Shadow was more than capable of overwhelming offense and unbreakable defense. The problem was numbers. Even with as many villains as the duo had already beaten down, there were still enough foes left that for every miscreant stopped, another would come at the raven-headed teen from another direction. Being forced to avoid a number of such attacks had deadened the fear the criminals had felt for him. That's when they'd redoubled their efforts to subdue him, some even making moves towards his classmates' position. "You imbeciles." Tokoyami did his best to remain in character, throwing bluffs as best he could. "Abandon your assault now, fools, or I shall be forced to, UGH. The worst-case scenario moment finally came. A villain with arms that could stretch from the elbows down had snuck in a long-range punch, catching the avian teen in the gut. As Tokoyami stumbled back, the first physical attack he'd taken in years throbbing through his body, the remaining villains began to laugh. The words the criminals threw out were nothing the raven-headed teen hadn't heard before: delusional, half-priced magician, son of a bird fucker. But between the pain and humiliation, something snapped. True, wrathful anger surged through Tokoyami, tinged with concern for his near-defenseless classmates. Before he could make use of the red-hot emotion, Dark Shadow re-emerged from his stomach, somehow grabbing his notebook on its way out. The sentient quirk held the book up, even though it was enclosed in a plastic Ziploc bag for maximum protection. The notebook had become a precious treasure to Tokoyami, as it was a gift from his friend. And it just might hold the best solution to their problem. "Wanna try it?" Dark Shadow's voice whispered over the pair's telepathic link, a secret the two had never shared with anyone else. The edgelord smirked in reply. "All you, is the little chicken already down for the count?" The chainsaw sword-wielding, three-armed villain jeered as he closed the distance to his prey. After an embarrassing and ridiculously drawn-out scuffle, the bird brain was down and about to be out. The villain's victorious thoughts turned to confusion when his quarry began to shake. "I tried to warn you," Tokoyami grit out, picking up his act again. The avian teen had to fake feeling pain from the blow to his stomach as well, Dark Shadow's presence dulling the ache. "Now stare into the abyss." The three-armed villain cocked his head, amused that the teen was still on his melodramatic kick. But it was time to say bye-bye to make-believe and pay his pound of flesh. Painfully. "Enough with your delusions," the villain mocked, readying his chainsaw sword for a final blow. "Wait. What the hell are you doing?" Before the final blow was struck, the bird brain had been engulfed in his own shadow. The completely silhouetted form of the student stood up. And kept going up. The remains of the horde watched with mounting concern as the figure grew in both height and musculature. Before long, the darkened student almost resembled All Might, if the #1 hero had been made of licking shadows reminiscent of black fire. When the imposing figure turned its face to the villains, the amassed grunts couldn't help but flinch. Its eyes. They were so much worse than they'd been before. The white eyes from earlier were nowhere to be found, only burning yellow slits in a sea of black that oozed malevolence. But the worst part? It no longer felt like it was human eyes that were looking back at them. "Look at what we have here," the shadowy form's voice was, distorted, an echo of multiple speakers hissing over each other. The very words themselves itched under the collective skin of the thugs. So many delicious souls to torment. The three-armed villain shook off his misgivings first, beyond pissed that this brat thought they'd fall for the same trick twice. "Enough of this bullshit already," the criminal shouted, swinging his buzzing weapon against the neck of the creature looming over him. The attack connected and nothing. The creature didn't even so much as flinch. "What the fuck?" The whirring teeth of the weapon's buzzsaw blade revved to full speed, and the villain could feel the resistance of it sinking into something in its way. But there was no indication of a successful hit. There was no ripping of shadow or flesh, no sparks or gouts of blood, not even the expected sound of such a weapon biting into its target was produced. It was like the teeth were being stopped short, just shy of touching the creature. It was almost like trying to cut something that wasn't there. "Oh, we're going to have so much fun," the creature chuckled, swallowing up the chainsaw sword in a giant clawed hand. Effortlessly, the monster crushed the weapon, revving teeth and all, like it was nothing. "Please. Feel free to struggle." From their hunkered-down spots, Koji and Aoyama shrunk away in fear. Their classmate appeared to have succumbed to madness, and they didn't want to witness him killing everything that ran across his path. That Tokoyami was liberally smashing villains against the concrete ground and into ruined vehicles with a gleeful laugh didn't help their perception at all. Simultaneously, in the ruined zone, all things considered, Kirishima really thought he and his group of displaced classmates were doing pretty well for themselves. Sure, they'd been separated from their class and surrounded by villains that had infiltrated their school's training facility, but that hadn't stopped them from kicking ass. The criminal's jaw he just broke with a hardened punch was a great example. Having just downed his latest foe, the red-headed teen took a moment to check up on the others fighting with him. Ojiro was effortlessly weaving between two villains with his manly martial arts skills, even using his tail to slide himself between one of their legs to dodge an arm made of stone. Even as he watched, the tailed teen flipped himself up and over, wrapping his arms around both his attackers' necks while using his body's momentum to slam their heads into the ground. Satisfied Ojiro had everything under control at the moment, Kirishima darted forward and slammed a hardened leg into a villain that had been charging at him. The redhead crouched over the unconscious form of his latest takedown and dismissed any notion of looking for signs of Taru. As soon as the quartet had descended from the remains of the penthouse, the invisible girl had discarded her gloves and shoes, stating she'd be of more use like that. And had she ever been right? Kirishima was still amazed at the versatility of the unseen girl. So far she'd tripped 4 separate villains that had almost gotten the drop on him, and Ojiro choked out 3 others that had been hanging back to take pot shots with their long-distance quirks, and had somehow started 2 different infighting incidents between different groups of their enemies. The girl was like a ninja. A manly ninja. And then there was Mina. The pink-hued girl was kicking some serious ass. And the redhead didn't just think that because he'd watched her use her manly breakdancing skills to reverse axe kick a guy so hard he spat out teeth. When he hadn't been looking, Kirishima had to admit that his awesome friend had also gone and learned how to incorporate her quirk into her own unique fighting style. Acid-infused strikes from hands and feet effortlessly flowed after splashes of burning viscous liquid, the corrosive substances excreted from any of the girl's exposed skin. No villain could get close to Mina as long as she could keep herself going and fight through the drawbacks of using acid too much. Which is what had Kirishima worried. He'd seen what could happen if his friend overused her quirk, even still had a few nightmares. In their current situation, the redhead didn't know if he'd be able to break away if worst came to worst and keep Mina from pushing too far. Gah! The sudden shout of pain caused Kirishima to jerk his gaze away from his pink-hued friend's breakdance of doom. His heart immediately sank when his eyes found the cry's source. Ojiro had been captured. "All right, you little shits. That's enough." The villain that had captured the martial artist yelled. The criminal's quirk was terrifying to be sure, even excluding the spider-like mandibles the man bore, appearing to be some kind of silken strings that were shot from his thick, gnarled fingers. "Just give me a reason, and I'll suck this kid dry." Ojiro, now bound with his arms and tail painfully tied against his sides, tried to struggle, but the threads holding him only tightened. When it became difficult to breathe, the martial artist was forced to accept he wouldn't be escaping on his own. It was a blow to the tailed teen's pride to be sure, but he hated more the fact that he'd also just endangered his classmates as well. Left with no other options, Kirishima and Mina quickly relaxed their fighting stances. Both teens knew they weren't fast enough to reach their classmate before his captor either crushed him or drained him. Instantly, the redhead and Rosette were grabbed by the few remaining villains. Roughly, 2 villains snatched Kirishima's arms and torqued them behind his back, pulling a hiss from the teen as they frog-marched him to their arachnid-like compatriot. A distance away, Mina was bodily lifted into the air before being carried over by a villain with multiple pitch-black spindly arms and a face more skeletal than anything. "Say, Kumajao-san," the ghoulish villain wheezed, sounding as half-dead as he looked, "what would you say to dinner? And a show?" One of the thin, elongated limbs that had wrapped around Mina loosened, disgustingly trailing up and down her figure in a macabre parody of a sales pitch. The arachnid-faced villain, Kumajao, turned to consider his associate's offer, absent-mindedly pulling Ojiro backward by his silken bonds and grabbing the tailed teen by the back of his neck. Kirishima lunged wildly at the filth that dared threaten his pink-hued friend so blatantly, his blood boiling at the utterly petrified look that stared back at him from black and gold eyes. Unfortunately, the villains holding the redhead expected such a reaction, and only hauled him back, kicking and screaming. You drive a hard bargain, Guryabuki. Kumajao drawled after an obviously fake moment of thought. A perverse grin pulled at the villain's mandibles. But I think that sounds perfect, if you let me go. Snap. Gah. To the shock of all present, the arm of the arachnid-faced villain that was holding Ojiro suddenly bent 90 degrees at the elbow. Completely opposite of how the joint was meant to go. The result. An arm so shattered bone could clearly be seen tearing through pulped flesh. The next few seconds passed by in a blur. Adrenaline still coursing through his veins, Kirishima reacted in the blink of an eye. Hardening his entire upper body, the redhead wrenched his arms back, driving his elbows into his captor's stomachs with as much force as he could muster. The villains instantly went slack, their ability to breathe severely limited by the sudden blinding pain radiating from their solar plexuses. Mina wasted no time herself, expelling her most corrosive acid from her entire body as quickly as she could. The ghoulish villain's depraved giggling, which only she'd been able to hear, rapidly transformed into howls of agony. The spindly limbs holding the rosette convulsed once before instinctively throwing the source of their torment away. The pink-hued teen clenched her eyes shut, readying for a rough collision with the ground. Which never came as two solid arms caught her falling body in a textbook Princess Carrie. And safe. Snapping her eyes open, Mina realized she'd been picked out of the air by none other than her red-headed friend. Kirishima was now on his knees, having slid from a run to be able to make the catch. "You okay there, horn buddy?" Mina felt herself blush. The care and concern her friend was directing at her too much, and too close, to handle with the butterflies that were currently invading her stomach. Acting before she could think too much on the bewildering emotion she was feeling, the rosette pushed the redhead's distressed face away with a boot to the nose. "Thanks, Carrie," Mina said, before remembering they were still missing two classmates. "Wait, is Ojiro okay? And where's Taru?" "Don't worry, Mina. We're okay," came the exuberant reply of the invisible girl. Looking over in the direction the bubbly voice had come from, the redhead and Rosette were treated to an odd sight. Ojiro was standing, half freed from his silk bindings, on top of Kumajao. Next to the tailed teen floated numerous strands of his restraints which, judging by how the threads bundled in two places, were being held by Taru. "Thank you for your aid, Hagakure-san," Ojiro thanked the invisible girl formally. "I shudder to think what would have happened if you hadn't interceded." The floating strands fluttered through the air, allowing the three watching teens to guess their classmate was waving off the thanks. Maybe she was blushing too? "It's no problem, Ojiro," Taru said. "It's what a real hero would have done. I just wish I hadn't had to be so brutal." That comment drew the eyes of the other three to the broken form of Kumajao, who did indeed look as if he'd been brutalized. On top of his wrecked arm there was now a growing bruise across the villain's temple. It was clear that Taru had held nothing back when rescuing her classmate. Enemies defeated, the quartet wondered what they should do next. Did they head for the plaza and see if their homeroom teacher needed help? Or did they hold down the fort as it were until rescue came while keeping an eye on their defeated foes? With only one vote for them to head out, the group settled into wait. "Hey Kirishima? Are you going to let go of Mina anytime soon?" Back at the plaza, Tsuyu sat back after helping the still weakened Izuku feed his blood to their dying teacher, silently watching the both of them heal. The frog girl noticed two things. The first was Izuku's regeneration had slowed, once again, which could be expected due to his recent blood loss, and the second was that his fever appeared to have lessened dramatically. That observation confused her. Repositioning her cinnamon roll's head back to her lap, Tsuyu looked back at the continuing confrontation between All Might and the man-beast. "It's useless, All Might," Shigaraki shouted while the number one hero traded blow after blow with the enormous monster. The lanky villain nearly giggled at the sight of the struggling pro-hero. With his shock absorption quirk, Namu might as well be the anti-symbol of peace. No. Our very own symbol of terror. All Might paid little mind to the gloating villain, too busy dodging as many blows as possible and trying to force his strength to work properly. It was just his luck he was being shown the truth of Nezu's words like this. He really shouldn't have spent his whole 3 hours on little things better left for other heroes. Keep trying as much as you want, but you'd have better luck peeling off his skin and tearing him to bits, Shigaraki continued, smiling sadistically when he noticed All Might pause for a second. The lanky villain took it as a clear sign he'd gotten the pro hero's attention. But whether or not he'll allow you to do that? Now that's another question. All Might smirked to himself, thinking back to the earlier words shouted at him. He always found it funny how villains always tended to bring up the weaknesses in their own schemes whenever they felt confident. Overconfident, as he'd often proved. That works perfectly for me. The symbol of peace shouted as he evaded one last attack before circling around Namu and grappling him. Heaving with all his strength, All Might delivered an earth-shattering suplex, raising a massive cloud of dust in the process. No! Aizawa shouted as he bolted upright from where he'd lain, drawing the attention of the observing frog girl. She marveled at how fast her homeroom teacher was healing from such crippling wounds. That's exactly what they wanted. The warning compelled Sa to turn back to the fight, where the dust was beginning to settle. She almost wished it had taken its time. Before her very eyes was a sight too terrifying to consider. All Might, the symbol of peace, had been trapped. The mist villain had managed to open a portal underneath where the man-beast should have landed, opening the other side right below the pro hero. Unimpeded, Namu had dug his clawed fingers into the number 1 hero's sides, drawing blood. "We need to," Izuku groaned, trying to stand. The action surprised the frog girl, who noticed the green-haired teen was quickly beginning to look pale. "Help him." From his own position, Aizawa was struggling too. The underground hero wanted nothing more than to give his fellow teacher a hand, and maybe a large lecture after everything had been resolved. His labored movements did have one benefit though. They allowed the gruff teacher to realize his arm was no longer sporting broken bones and his decayed elbow was halfway to being fully healed. Aizawa had to admit, Izuku's blood was incredibly powerful. "The two of you will remain here until you're fully healed, Karo," Tsu barked, grabbing both males by their collars. With the frog girl being the only one uninjured of the three, it was easy for her to keep them down. That fact really drove home to the man and teen how useless they still were at the moment. And neither male could stand Tsu's glare either. Gwaha! A familiar groan caused the trio to turn their heads away from their staring contest. Tay had miraculously reached them, despite her broken state, and was using her good arm to push one last protein bar into Izuku's hands. Izuku took the horribly tasting thing with a grateful look at his dependable partner. "This will certainly help," the green-haired teen said as he unwrapped the bar and tore a tiny piece off. Handing the morsel to Aizawa, he wolfed down the rest. "That is one determined zombie," Aizawa remarked as he popped the measly scrap into his mouth. It was revoltingly bland, like washed-up cardboard, but he swallowed it anyway. Idly, the underground hero made a mental note that he'd understood the zombie girl telling Izuku he needed to eat and heal. The effects of the third bar were almost immediate for Izuku, who doubled over in pain as his regeneration kicked into high gear once again. The clear example of this was his foot, which now only lacked a couple toes and a lot of skin. For Aizawa, there was a few seconds delay, but then the gruff teacher felt his stomach suddenly feel full. Another handful of seconds later and he saw his wounds beginning to heal even faster. Although, why did he suddenly feel hot? Still trapped, All Might continued his struggle against the deadly grip Namu had dug into his old wound. The villain's claws were causing him tremendous pain. The number 1 hero tried to take a ragged breath, only to spit up blood. The instant it became obvious the symbol of peace wouldn't be able to free himself, Kuragi reenacted the next step in the plan, sinking the 2 combatants into his portal. Slowly. Well, it seems our trap worked, Shigaraki said with glee, his words earning the attention of the bound pro hero. "You see, Namu's job was only to slow you down, render you easy prey for the real attack. All Might resumed his struggling, but his efforts continued to end in vain. The number one hero's once insurmountable strength failed in the face of his earlier fatigue combined with the shooting agony being inflicted to his side. In just a few seconds, the portal you're slipping through will close. Shigaraki's voice grew dangerously more sadistic, the look in his single visible eye surpassing psychotic. Sure, it'll be gory, but I'm sure Kurogiri can get over dealing with half your entrails. Kurogiri himself was slightly put out that he wasn't able to reveal the details of the plan. He'd practiced in front of a mirror for most of the previous day just so that he could find the right words and mannerisms to give the event the grandiose feeling it deserved. However, in his current state, the misty villain knew using his quirk even this much was already pushing his limits. Speaking now would cost him focus he couldn't afford. All seemed lost, and those witnessing the tragedy unfolding before them not named Shigaraki or Kurogiri nearly lost heart, until a blitzing stream of ice rocketed onto the scene. Spears of frozen water quickly converged over half of the bestial Namu, impaling him in some places. The surprise attack loosened the monster's grip just enough, and the symbol of peace, not one to neglect an opportunity, immediately broke free and jumped clear of the portal sucking him under. Kurogiri, now spent, released the now useless stare in reality as soon as Namu had pulled himself out. The misty villain could feel his injuries and exhaustion piling up, much to his shame. He knew he only had one more use of his quirk in him. He'd need to save that for escape. You really think someone like you would be able to kill the symbol of peace? Questioned the stoic voice of Shito Todoroki. The heterochromic's flat eyes indicated just how little he thought of the villains assembled before him. Don't be ridiculous. To the dual-haired teens side-stepped Sero, Sao, and Mezzo, the trio lightly dusted in frost. Even so, the teens seemed ready to fight if the fire in their eyes was any indication. All Might could easily read the intentions of his students, and while he loved their heroic hearts, he knew he had to stop them before they did something foolish. Young Todoroki, I appreciate your help, All Might thanked while keeping his eyes locked on the villains, but you, all of you, need to get to safety. I will handle this. You say that? Todoroki's rebuttal came quickly, not willing to lose this opportunity to shine as a hero with his mother's inheritance alone, but you were really in a tight spot just now. Shigaraki eyed the newly arrived students with absolute hatred, cursing both the brats for interfering and the fodder he'd brought for failing to deal with them. His plan had almost succeeded. The lanky villain was no fool though. With the beating he'd already taken, he knew Kurogiri wouldn't be able to assist him now. However, he also knew that with Namu at his side, able to single-handedly contend with the number one hero, he might just be able to kill the symbol of trash himself. These new kids are a real bother. But it doesn't really matter, Shigaraki announced, causing All Might and the 4 teens to either tense up or fall into defensive stances. Namu. With but a single word, the bestial villain reacted. In a display akin to violent masochism, the man-beast did his best to stand straight, snapping off a frozen arm and leg in the process. What followed was worse than even the most grotesque of horror movies, as raw and exposed muscle and bones began to bubble and pulsate. In the blink of an eye, both missing limbs of the monstrous creature grew back, skin and all. The beast was ready to fight again. What? All Might's shout of surprise at this sudden development was completely understandable. You said his quirk was shock absorption. Shigaraki's vile grin was so large it could be seen peeking around the hand covering his face. I did indeed, the lanky villain agreed with a laugh, but I never said it was his only quirk. All Might's fierce blue eyes shot open at the revelation. Then it really was. You four. The number one hero, now knowing his students truly weren't ready for what they were facing, wasted no time in calling the teens' attention. Fall back. Sato and Sero glanced at each other on the heels of the harsh order. The sugar teen opened his mouth first. But listen to All Might, Aizawa interrupted. The gruff teacher, now fully healed, appeared exceedingly intimidating with his eyes glowing. blood red. Leave this fight to the pros. From where he stood, Shigaraki trembled. In near apoplectic rage. What had just happened shouldn't have been possible. Eraserhead had been tiptoeing at the gates of death not even 10 minutes ago, yet now the damnable underground hero was standing before him as if he was at full health. What the fuck? What the actual fuck? Shigaraki cursed when he couldn't think of an explanation for such a recovery. The heroes are using cheat codes now? That's not fair. All Might was at a loss as well. The pro hero had been sure not even Recovery Girl could have healed his broken co-worker. Aizawa-kun? The pro hero asked, his real question unspoken yet clear. Izuku, came Aizawa's soft-spoken reply. The answer was kept short and simple, leaving no room for error lest the villains hear the name of his problem child. All Might dipped his head in minute acceptance, though he couldn't keep the newly born concern from his face. I see. The number one hero said worriedly, memories of the Asui girl after being healed flashing before his mind's eye. And you're still yourself? The underground hero bit back a growl, immediately hating that the symbol of peace felt the need to ask such a question. There's no time for that, Aizawa bit out, rationally compartmentalizing his emotions so they didn't waste time arguing. You focus on the monster, I'll take the handsy one. Hearing their homeroom teacher's plan, Todoroki and his classmates prepared to join the fight. That is, until Aizawa fixed them with a truly chilling glare. Out, the teens ran to the stairs, only to find their classmate Kaminari still recovering from shorting out his brain and a mangled tail. Still uncertain if the zombie girl would bite if they neared her, Sero and Sato only grabbed the fried blonde before continuing their retreat. From their new position behind a clump of bushes, Izuku and Tsuyu watched as the battle recommenced. The green duo had come up with a plan, one that required a specific set of events to occur before implementation. Before he'd gone to join All Might, Aizawa had postulated that defeating Shigaraki would end the fighting. The underground hero had then put his focus into capturing and neutralizing the lanky villain. That led to the problem of dealing with the beastly Namu, who'd so far proven only concerned with fighting All Might and protecting his master. Which is exactly what the plan counted on. If Aizawa attacking Shigaraki drew Namu to his aid, All Might would intervene and restrain the monster. And if that happened, Izuku would take the chance to hijack the bestial villain by dousing the creature's exposed brain in his blood. It was risky, and his first offensive use of his quirk, ever, but it seemed like their best shot to the green-haired teen. The hero in training also didn't want to draw attention to how winded the symbol of peace appeared, no doubt the result of whatever highly dangerous and taxing mission the pro hero had been on. That was the reason he'd been late arriving at the USJ. How? Shigaraki shouted, engaging Eraserhead in a bout of CQC. The lanky villain learned the hard way after a quick sleight of hands resulted in only a punch to the face instead of the expected decayed shoulder that his quirk was once again being suppressed. His best advantage was gone. How is this possible? Aizawa only smirked behind his writhing capture tool scarf, his red eyes unblinking. Wouldn't you like to know? The underground hero taunted, his words chosen to inflict fear into his opponent. Making his move, the gruff teacher flicked his scarf around Shigaraki's arms before implementing a judo throw as quickly as possible. The pain groan from the lanky villain was proof enough his attacks were leaving marks. In their own clash of the titans, All Might and Namu continued to trade blow after blow. Then the bestial villain heard Shigaraki groan in pain. The creature attempted to disengage the symbol of peace to assist the lanky villain, but was immediately placed in a full Nelson by the number one hero. The only place you're going, All Might boomed as he locked his arms around the massive villain, is a prison cell. Namu screeched like a rabid animal as he resisted the hold with every ounce of strength he had. The inability to fulfill either of his primary missions, kill All Might and protect Shigaraki, was a searing spike of pure agony to his brain. Now, All Might was startled when he heard the unmistakable voice of 1A's green-haired problem child cry out, but the pro hero held tightly to his prisoner regardless. Even what felt like hands and feet crawling on his back wasn't enough to loosen his grip one iota. The weight was so light it could have only belonged to one of his students anyway. Then the symbol of peace watched as Izuku vaulted over his head, bloodied hand extended toward Namu. The green duo had started to run toward All Might the moment he'd locked his arms around the bestial villain. Tsuyu had leapt first, sticking to their teacher's back to provide an additional platform for her crazy cinnamon roll to make his own leap from. Izuku had utilized the support to the fullest, flinging himself up and at his target with ease. That's when it all went wrong. "I've got you," Izuku celebrated as he slammed his blood-covered hand onto Namu's exposed brain, only for everything to explode in blinding pain. Seeing young Midoriya not only land on the monstrous villain, but also shove a blood-soaked hand onto the beast's brain was enough shock for All Might to momentarily loosen his grip on the monster. Said monster lost no time in reacting to his newest assailant. Powerful hands crushed Izuku's body in a devastating overhead clasp before throwing the green-haired teen away like a used rag. "Izuku!" Tsuyu screamed as she watched their plan fall apart. The frog girl hopped to her cinnamon roll as quickly as she could, not noticing in the slightest that all the fighting had stopped. All eyes were now glued to the ruined teen. "Oh no!" Aizawa muttered as he took in the sight of his beloved student. Young Midoriya. All Might bellowed, ignoring the blood that trickled from his mouth and sighed in favor of concentrating on his wounded student. "Izuku!" rasped the long unused voice of Tei as she redoubled her efforts to reach her master. "Izuku!" The zombie girl tried to force more words out as she crawled, but her body finally collapsed, unable to continue further. "No! No!" Shigaraki cried as he was dragged by his feet into a portal of darkness. Izuku spasmed as his lungs fought desperately for air. He could feel that most of his internal organs had been crushed by Namu's counterattack, and his blood was working beyond overtime to keep him alive. Focusing on the memory of forcing his will through his body like he had earlier and look at the battle zone. He'd never forgive himself if his mistake had caused Tsuyu to get hurt. Instead, Izuku saw it. The body of the monstrous Namu spread out on the ground, twitching. And then, Izuku's damaged nerves registered that he had something in his hand. His bloodied hand. Finding it easier to move his eyes instead of his devastated limbs, the green-haired teen looked down and saw he was holding a large piece of Namu's brain. Before falling unconscious, the last thing Izuku saw after that was Tsuyu crying. "Magnus, if you think All Might looks too weak here, remember that his heroic spirit was not rekindled by Izuku like it was in canon.